Amelia just wrote she was having trouble.
Probably in the waiting room.
Yep, she's just entered the waiting room. I just admitted her. Hi, everyone. Just give us a few minutes while people are trickling in. By the way, Will, did you want to make sure that you can share your slides before we get started?
Sure. So that's what it looks like.
Yep.
Seems right.
I see it
You can
just
see the
fine.
mouse.
Perfect.
Very good.
Yep. Thank you.
And John is not on yet?
I haven't seen him yet. So we've got Amelia and Steve.
And Agnes Kissing demonstrating proper mask wearing even in the Zoom photo.
It's a mask from the Philippines. Take note.
It's gorgeous, yeah.
Oh, that's
Thank
a
you.
great photo, Agnes.
You can see I'm smizing through my mask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there we've got John. So we've got all three authors and discussant for the first paper. Why don't we give it just another minute or two because we've still got people piling in.
I just want to check that you guys can hear me. I think you can now, right?
Yes, we do. Thanks,
Thank
Amelia.
you. Too many webcams.
Why don't I go ahead and just provide a very brief introduction. So thank you all for taking time today to join us for the second of the two-part series that the AAEA, the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, is sponsoring on what matters in agricultural economics, setting the agenda for the Handbook of Agricultural Economics, Volume 6. The first part of this two-part workshop was on Tuesday. The recording from that will be available soon on the AAEA website. So if you missed it or you enjoyed it so much you want to watch it again or you want to direct your students to see it, that link should be made available fairly soon through the AAEA and its newsletter. But today we're going to hear 4 more of the chapters presented. And I wanted to start by thanking the team at AAEA for making all of this possible. As we all know, setting up these things takes a bit of background work, and Allison and her team at the business office have done a terrific job in arranging all the details of this workshop and Tuesday's workshop, as well as the 2 predecessor ones that occurred in October for Volume 5. This is the time when we're putting together the newest versions of the Handbook of Agricultural Economics. As most of you are aware, the publisher Elsevier has a series, the Handbook and Economics series, covers all the major areas of economics. It's one of the core references in the discipline. And the Handbook of Agricultural Economics was first edited by Gordon Rauser at UC Berkeley and and Bruce Gardner at the University of Maryland. Volumes 1 and 2 appeared back in 2001 and 2002. And then volumes 3 and 4 were edited by Bob Evanson of Yale and Prabhu Pingali, a colleague here at Cornell. And those published in the latter part of the 2000s, in 2008-9. Elsevier invited David Just and I, both here at Cornell, to edit volumes 5 and 6. So we are deeply honored to have the opportunity to think about where are the current research frontiers, what has changed enough since volumes 1 through 4 that it merits something as substantial as a handbook chapter. Handbook chapters are very substantial, as most of you who've looked at them are aware. These are something on the order of 35,000 word chapters. So they're meant to be defining the current research frontiers and helping to chart future research directions for especially young scholars. Handbook chapters historically are heavily cited and of particular use to graduate students and postdocs and young faculty, or just young at heart faculty embarking on a new line of research where we need some expert to define for us what is the received canon and what are the really important unsettled issues in the field, and what are the assumptions that people have been making that perhaps merit some further reflection and relaxation, and what have been the data or theoretical or methodological impediments to making progress that people might think about trying to improve upon. So we're really fortunate today to have 4 outstanding draft chapters presented. The purpose of this workshop is for the chapter authors to have a chance to share with all of us their current thinking about the content of their chapters. And I emphasize current thinking. These are not yet in review. So we are asking the chapter authors to make available drafts, in some cases partial drafts, far in advance of when they actually need to submit a complete draft chapter. And the purpose is so that they can solicit input from all of you. In each case, we have an outstanding discussant set up. So the chapter authors will present their thinking on what they believe belongs in the chapter handbook that they're authoring. They will explain to you the content, their thinking, the evidence they would like to put forward in that chapter. And then we have a discussant who will reflect upon that and give them some feedback. And then we have an open question and answer session. We'll start each session at the top of the hour. We'll try to break a few minutes before the end of the hour, just so that those who are going to continue through have an opportunity to stretch their legs, grab a bio break, refresh coffee, whatever. So I'll try to be fairly strict on timing, but please feel free to use chat to pose questions to people. Please feel free to follow up with chapter authors after today if you don't have a chance to offer comments or questions, or if you just want to have a more in-depth exchange with them. The whole point of today is this is an opportunity for the community to weigh in and help to crowdsource ideas and evidence that chapter authors can then incorporate in what will be key chapters of Volume 6 of the Handbook of Agricultural Economics. So with that prologue, I want to thank and acknowledge my co-editor, David Just, who has a good deal of teaching that's crowded on to Thursday. So David will come and go over the course of the day with us. I'll bear primary responsibility for moderating today. But let me now turn over to Will Masters, who along with Amelia Finaret and Stephen Block are authoring one of the handbook chapters on nutritional issues. We'll kick off now. It's a few minutes early, so implicitly you guys get an extra several minutes if you like to use them. I'm sure people will be happy to have an extra couple minutes at the end if we finish on our regularly scheduled duration. But without further ado, let me turn over to Will, and John Hodnott will be the discussant when the presentation is done. Thank you very much. Over to you, Will.
Super. Yeah, thanks, Chris. And David, this is a huge task to pull together these handbooks, and a great service, and feel really privileged to be asked to look at this literature on the burdens of malnutrition. So our task was to review the literature on what's often being called the triple burden, or multiple burdens more generally, of malnutrition, literature with very, very old roots, so present in the early handbooks, but just amazing rapid growth now. And to look at these multiple burdens and how they change over time, particularly driven by dietary transition and food choice, and especially this transformation of the food system during economic development. So to cover that, have the real privilege to be able to work with Amelia Finaret, who did her master's degree in Ag Econ at Iowa State with late Wally Huffman and others, before a PhD at Tufts in nutrition, and now teaching at Allegheny College, and Steve, who many of you know, on macro development, trade and policy, to cover the structural transformation side of the story. So the way we've approached this chapter is to divide in three, and to look first at the measurement questions. So these are largely non-market attributes of food. So the classical triple burden of malnutrition is undernutrition, especially early in life, maternal and child, that leaves children stunted in their linear growth and unable to fulfill their genetic potential in many other dimensions as well. And then the second burden is unwanted weight gain, typically later in life, that is associated with diabetes, hypertension, and vulnerability to cardiometabolic diseases generally. And then the third burden, the triple, third dimension, the triple burden, is continued throughout this process, inadequacies and sometimes excesses of specific vitamins, minerals, and other micronutrients, components of the diet that that contribute to this triple burden of, on the one hand, undernutrition and stunting and often being too thin, especially early in life, then unwanted weight gain later in life, and continued deficiencies of specific components of the diet. So this triple burden is actually multidimensional in every one of the parts of it. And so Amelia will cover that part of the chapter first. The literature on that is tremendously large, very rich, and she'll do that very quickly. Then section 2 is how these change over time. So what is the nutrition transition? Broadly speaking, from under to over to just right as economic development proceeds. And Steve will address that. And then I'll turn to food choice and the micro evidence on how the food system evolves to drive the dietary part of this. As you'll learn from Amelia in a moment, there's a lot of non-dietary components to this. And it's very important to recognize that these are mostly non-market phenomena, in which people don't know what's in food that would affect their health. And if they did know what's in the food, they wouldn't be able to predict its outcome for them. And so there's no equalization of marginal cost among people. There's no market directly to buy health through food. And so revealed preference is very limited in its ability to reflect these non-market attributes. But in this third section, we'll look at the degree to which those are reflected in the policy agenda, the research agenda, that's super exciting coming out of this literature. So Amelia, you can tell me when to advance.
Okay, great. Yeah, will do. So yeah, like Will was saying, the revealed preferences about what people choose to eat really can't tell us that much in terms of what they actually care about in terms of their health, because we don't know about a lot of the components of foods that people might choose. And even given that, dietary intake is really just one aspect of nutritional status. So what I want to do is try to outline a little bit about the other aspects of nutritional status that matter. Because measurement, of course, as economists, we're really concerned with measurement as an aspect of understanding this highly multidimensional outcome as nutritional status, right? Which is just as highly dimensional as health in general, or as you know, trying to maximize utility, right? Which, you know, is so analogously to that, it has a lot of complicating kind of factors. And so nutrition is really determined in context too. And so the most salient kind of context for everyone that really applies is this nutrition transition. And the nutrition transition was first conceptualized, defined, and outlined by Barry Popkin in the mid-90s. And he really talked about it as stages of nutritional status that also, of course, interacted with disease, the different types of disease, transitioning from too little to then too much to then just right amounts of nutrition and food, which of course then interacted with different types of disease. So starting with high degree of burden for infectious disease and transitioning into a higher degree of burden for non-communicable disease. And we know now that this transition is not necessarily linear for countries or for communities. And we also know now that the transition can happen for individuals and for families across their life course. And so there are deficits and excesses that can happen for individual nutrients kind of throughout. We can still have deficits of nutrients now, maybe, essential fatty acids would be one that we'd be concerned with in the United States. In our stage of the nutrition transition would be a deficit, right? It's not just excesses. So I think that we want to talk about the three kind of main burdens that Will mentioned in terms of what the triple burden is usually conceptualized as. And the first one would be hunger. And so hunger is the physiological, right, sensation of, wanting to eat. But there are lots of different scientific conceptualizations of this concept. And the first one is prevalence of undernourishment. The way that this is calculated is using food balance sheets, right? So the calorie supply in a country divided by the number of people in the country, and then the individual people are having certain calorie needs calculated based on their body size and physical activity, which are the two main components of calorie needs. And so undernourishment is estimated from these food balance sheets by the FAO, but of course this is related to other aspects of too few calories, right? Like food insecurity, which can be measured using a bunch of different types of survey instruments and is more related to kind of the social aspects of obtaining enough healthy food for a healthy and active life. And then growth faltering, which ag economists have been studying for a long time, linear growth faltering mainly for children, which is measured as a height for age relative to a healthy population. And growth faltering in and of itself, of course, is not harmful, except that it causes obstructed labor. So it has these intergenerational effects that can cause more malnutrition down the road. And then thinness or wasting, of course, which is measured using weight for height relative to a healthy population. So the thinness of children and adults that can happen, but also growth faltering in terms of linear growth, which is associated with adverse outcomes later in life, but does not cause them, right, except obstructed labor, like I was saying. So once we are kind of escaping from the deficits of hunger, the transition brings us to the too much, right, of certain nutrients, especially carbohydrates, especially solid fats, and especially added sugars. And what this happens, and Barry Popkin talked about this as kind of a mismatch between the technology that we have in the food system now and our biological drive to put on weight, right? It makes sense that our bodies want to put on weight. We want to be able to have stored fat in case of emergency. Every extra pound on your body is 2 days of life, right? This is what our bodies are trying to do. So overweight is defined as unwanted weight gain from imbalanced diets. And so body mass index, which is the ratio of weight to height, extrapolated from the WHO. And then this is, of course, all related to other aspects of overconsumption. And BMI, higher BMI is, again, not harmful in and of itself, except that it is associated with different non-communicable diseases, especially diabetes and metabolic disorders of glucose metabolism, and hypertension and cardiovascular disease, which are diseases of inflammation. So, of course, the vitamins and minerals that can reduce inflammation in the body are really important for treating and preventing non-communicable disease. And so we're moving right from hunger, from not enough nutrition to too much of certain things. And then the third dimension is micronutrient deficiencies. And this is really the third burden of the triple burden as it's typically conceptualized. So this is individual vitamins and minerals and other dietary components, especially vitamin A, iron, iodine, zinc, and folate, right, to prevent neural tube defects. So these are the three kind of main dimensions, and kind of deficits or excesses in either one of them is going to be causing challenges. So all of these challenges about calories, fats, proteins, carbohydrates, about micronutrients, what causes disease, these dimensions of nutrition have been studied for a really long time. Since antiquity, scholars across all different kinds of disciplines have been interested in how food relates to health for centuries. And it's a really complicated thing to study because these things interact in the body, they interact with our health status, and they interact with each other in the body. So we have the example of the studies about scurvy and the discovery of vitamin C later on that were some of the first epidemiological studies. And now there's a lot of new discoveries happening, not about vitamins and minerals, right, but also about other food components that are not vitamins or minerals. So to be a vitamin or a mineral, those are nutrients, they're essential nutrients that have to be taken in from the outside, and they're nutrients in the sense that they're responsible for a specific biological function, right? But there's other components in foods that are not responsible for specific biological functions, but they are impactful on health in other ways. For example, goitrogens, right, which are compounds in certain vegetables that can reduce the ability of your gut to absorb iodine, right? Hence the name goitrogens. So there's a lot of interactions that happen with these non-nutrient components of foods that we eat. And so even with a lot of knowledge about individual nutrients and how individual nutrients and non-nutrient compounds affect the body, even with a lot of this knowledge, understanding the full effects of diet on health is really challenging because no one really knows the health effects, especially the long-term health effects of what foods are. And it's impossible to learn these through trial and error because we as individuals, we eat every day, we have these lived experiences about food. We might think we know things that we don't actually know. And we won't know about how food affects our health until it's too late because these things happen over the life course, over the long term. And so the three kind of main dimensions of diet quality that we think that ag economists are kind of mainly interested in, and this is also how dietitians and nutritional epidemiologists would conceptualize it, is for macronutrients having the right amount of fat, protein, and carbohydrates, having the right amount of micronutrients, and for a lot of micronutrients, too much is bad, right? So you don't want to have too much vitamin A, that can cause birth defects. You don't want to have too much iodine, that can also cause goiter, for example. And of course, you also don't want to have too much or too little of these other non-nutrient compounds, right? For example, goitrogens, for example, polyphenols or phytates or oxalates, which can all reduce mineral absorption in the body. And also aflatoxin, which is a food safety concern. Aflatoxin is a mold that can cause cancer. It's carcinogenic and also can cause stunting. So these three dimensions of diet quality, they interact in the body, they interact with different types of disease. And so we need to know how to measure them, right? So for agricultural economists to study nutrition, understanding sort of how nutritional epidemiologists measure nutritional status could be really useful. And so what they do is they use a mnemonic device, which of course is very helpful, especially for me. So you have the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? And it's nice that it works out like this. And starting with anthropometry, which is measurements of the body on the outside of the body, right? And that starts with height and weight as the easiest ones to do, but then can go into much more detailed measurements of the body, such as head circumference, such as the mid-upper arm circumference, height to waist to hip ratios to measure the distribution of fat in the body, which matters for cardiovascular outcomes. And so anthropometry is a really important aspect of measuring nutritional status. Biomarkers are also really important. This is measurements of blood lipids, of glucose, of different vitamin and mineral statuses using blood, urine, and stool and tissue samples. Clinical indicators also are very important, and this is what you would be able to find out as a clinician with your patient, right? Looking at skin pallor and nails and dryness and around the mouth for vitamin C deficiency, for example. Dietary intake is another really important aspect, and this is where a lot of agricultural economics has focused in terms of nutrition. And it's also really hard to measure, kind of surprisingly, even if I tried really hard to write down what I ate, it would be hard to do accurately. Environmental and social factors are another aspect of this, such as exposure to infectious disease through a lack of sanitation. And then growing now as a major aspect of healthy diets is food groups. So food groups meaning the types of foods that you eat in a single meal, because different nutrients interact in certain ways when they're consumed together, such as a grain and a legume, which when consumed together can provide a complete protein with all the essential amino acids, as opposed to when consumed separately, it's much harder for the body to make that into a complete protein. Or for example, when you consume a high iron meal along with a lot of calcium, the calcium can inhibit the iron from that meal. And then of course, finally, governance is a really important aspect of nutrition, and governments do get a lot into nutritional policy to try to nudge people in certain directions. But given all of this, right, I think that it's important just to note that it's a highly multidimensional aspect of well-being. So measuring it is really important, and knowing what you're measuring is important. And then dietary intake is an essential aspect of this that agricultural economists look at a lot. And so Steve is going to get into the stylized facts on that.
Thanks, Amelia. So the nutritional transition is inseparable from the agricultural transformation that was classically described by Peter Timmer in the first volume of the Handbook on Agricultural Economics, as well as the structural transformation. But these joint processes all point to two broad and very robust characteristics of economic development, namely income growth and urbanization. So this section of the chapter outlines these processes and uses cross-country data, the data from the WHO and FAO that Amelia described, to illustrate stylized facts as they relate to the nutrition transition. And this first slide, we start with this sort of the double burden part of the triple burden, where we're looking at undernourishment and the prevalence of undernourishment, the prevalence of overweight as functions of per capita income. So we've created these Preston curves that feature the two-dimensional non-parametric relationships between these outcomes and per capita income across countries. And clearly, the prevalence of undernourishment declines rapidly as a function of per capita income, just as conversely overweight increases with per capita income. It's kind of interesting to note as well, though, that the variation around those non-parametric means diminishes. So there's a lot of convergence in the undernourishment as income increases, but we see, if anything, greater variation around that non-parametric path with regard to the prevalence of overweight. Now, these are, as Amelia pointed out, modeled data. There could be some artifacts captured in here, but these broad relationships are quite robust. Next. There we go. So now we know that the prevalence of undernourishment, changes in undernourishment, changes in overweight are not commensurate with one another in a one-to-one way, but we thought it would be, we could gain some interesting insights into the evolution of the double burden part of the triple burden by juxtaposing the paths over time at the level of regional aggregation. And so we've adapted this format of the classical ratanogram into looking at the double burden here of malnutrition, where we have the prevalence of undernourishment on the horizontal axis, the prevalence of overweight on the vertical axis. If a country were to reduce undernourishment at the same rate that it was increasing the prevalence of overweight, it would trace a path upwards and to the left along the 45-degree lines. And the fact that we see at the level of regional aggregation, at least every region, with the temporary exception of sub-Saharan Africa, crossing these 45-degree lines from below quite strongly, in fact, suggests that when we think about the evolution of this double burden, we're seeing regions increasing the prevalence of overweight much more rapidly than they are reducing the prevalence of undernourishment. Sub-Saharan Africa actually is an exception here, where it was crossing 45-degree lines from above for much of this period between 2001 and 2016, but finally, in the last few years, reverses course and actually increases undernourishment a little bit while increasing the prevalence of overweight. But the global mean is very clear. The path is virtually straight up. I mean, we have some reduction in undernourishment, but a much more rapid increase in the prevalence of overweight. Next slide. Now, as I said, we know that income growth and urbanization proceed together, broadly speaking. And what we're trying to do here is to start to separate out these broad drivers with regard to the prevalence of undernourishment. And next, we'll look at the prevalence of overweight. And the way we try to separate this out is by starting in the left-hand graph. So we saw before the negative association between the prevalence of undernourishment and per capita income. We see a very similar looking relationship here in the left-hand graph, which is just a two-dimensional non-parametric relationship between the prevalence of undernourishment and, in this case, urban population share. So we're tracing urbanization. So these things look the same. So to try to separate these things out, what we do in the right-hand figure is move from 2 dimensions to 3. So we have on the right-hand side a partially linear or semi-parametric regression, where we're controlling linearly for per capita income. And when we do that, the relationship that we see in the left-hand graph disappears. It's basically a flat, no relationship between the prevalence of undernourishment and the urban population share that results from controlling for income. So the answer to this question is the escape from undernourishment via urbanization. The answer is no, it's income. But we see a really interesting distinction when we move to the prevalence of overweight, where again, the figure on the left is the two-dimensional non-parametric, where we see the prevalence of overweight increasing quite strongly as a function of urbanization. And in the right-hand graph, with the partially linear model, we control, again, linearly for per capita income, but it has no effect on the positive association between the prevalence of overweight and urban population share. So this suggests that increases in the prevalence of overweight are much more strongly driven by urbanization, the kinds of lifestyle changes that we would associate with urban populations, or things that are correlated with urbanization that are not per capita income. Next slide. And then we bring in some stylized facts with regard to the third dimension of the triple burden, the micronutrient malnutrition. So these graphs are both, again, Preston curves that look at, they're both, the sample in both cases are children under 5. Again, these are modeled data. And the prevalence of anemia declines very rapidly, or at least steadily, as a function of per capita income. Same for vitamin A deficiency, which flattens out a little bit at sort of the higher levels. Now we know that anemia, for example, could result from a wide range of morbidities in addition to iron deprivation in the diet. But all of these things are, sort of negatively correlated with income. And in particular, when we look at both anemia and vitamin A deficiency, we know that as income increases, dietary diversity increases, the quality of calories consumed improves as well. And so this, I think, qualifies as a stylized fact with regard to micronutrient malnutrition.
Good. Yeah. Thanks, Stephen and Amelia. So, our approach to this chapter has been to, in each case, kind of digest the literature, describe the most recent contributions, including the work of many people on the call, and to, as Steve just described, sort of illustrate these things in terms of these data visualizations. So I hope that folks, sort of watching this, get a sense of the literature behind the pictures that we're seeing, and appreciate the opportunity to kind of look at it in terms of the data, in terms of all the variance at each income level, in terms of the trends of individual countries that sometimes buck the cross-country patterns, and the cross-country patterns in this case. So Steve did a great job of looking at this nutrition transition in terms of these health outcomes that are mapped using a variety of metrics that Amelia described. We can now turn to the sort of basic ag econ agenda of explaining food choice and the food system, the agricultural supply chains, the market infrastructure, the regulatory regime that leads to the composition of the foods that we see in the marketplace. So this is the food balance sheet evidence from FAO aggregation of national production plus imports minus exports and estimated loss to what's left in the diet. On the top left, what you have is every country in the world. These are class slides through 2011, so I'm about to update them for the chapter. But what you see is the Bennett's law transition as people go in caloric intake to higher levels of total calories because people are bigger, taller, and in many cases more physically active as well. There's also more food waste. This is just controlling for food waste prior to kitchen and plate waste. The pattern being of increasing total consumption without much Bennett's law. So not much expansion of the dietary diversity out of starchy staples at low levels of dietary intake. So total calories increase with the Green Revolution basic staples increasing up to this range of calories per capita, and then dietary diversity in national average terms begins to pick up, and you get to countries at the later stages of this dietary transition where there's reversals of patterns and things in this range. A lot of interest in how the food system increasingly uses animal-sourced foods, and very important reversals in that at the high end of dietary intake, and this disconnect between nutritionists' emphasis on the nutritional values and the health promoting values of fruits and vegetables and the clear lack of revealed preference for them, where at higher levels of income, with the extraordinary exception of East Asian countries, you just do not see. So this is a deep disconnect where East Asians' revealed preference for fruits and vegetables stands in contrast to other parts of the world where increased income does not typically raise fruit and vegetable consumption, despite the clear evidence for their value for health. And there are important paradoxes in food choice within high income countries where this food balance sheet type picture for the United States of total availability net of estimated loss at every stage of the market, including kitchen and plate waste. These are the USDA estimates, and what's most dramatic here, so this shows from 1970 to 2014, again, about to update this to 2017, which is the most recent data that are available now. What you see is the extraordinary reversal of Bennett's law in the United States, where, so these are calories from each of the major food groups you see here, where the flour and cereals food group was roughly constant, slight trend upwards per capita until 1981, and then rose very sharply, more than 100 calories a day, to a peak in around 2001 before stabilizing again. And added sugars had a similar rise in that period. Added sugars actually declined, flour and cereals just stayed high. So this is a rush into carbohydrates that's a reversal of Bennett's law. In terms of the nutrient-dense food groups with higher levels of micronutrients and protein per unit of food, what you see is this rush out of beef in favor of chicken. That's pretty well known in the agricultural economics community. Perhaps less well known is the rise of nuts to be almost as big as total fruit in terms of calorie intake, which is quite remarkable, and the lack of significant increase in many other food groups. So we see a huge transformation of the food system, not just among food groups, but between forms of food, where in particular food becomes increasingly packaged, processed, and branded at higher levels of income, just very high expenditure. This is in dollar terms, so lots of premium for convenience and taste and other attributes that are clearly, strongly revealed preferred by consumer expenditure. And a lot of that is food away from home at high levels of income. Clearly, in both packaged food and food away from home, the consumer no longer knows what's in the food. And even if you do know what's in the food, very interesting patterns with respect to, for example, sugar-sweetened carbonated beverages, where this rapid rise at relatively low levels of income. And Steve contributed a really remarkable analysis of these data from the Nutrition Innovation Lab household survey data. So looking for agricultural economists interested in development in the food transformation at very low income levels. This is looking within very low income countries at the income distribution in household survey data, where the Nutrition Innovation Lab surveys asked about not just food groups in the classic sense, but packaged and processed foods and sugar sweetened beverages. And what you see is that even within these very low income countries, it's at the lowest levels of income that these have the highest overall budget shares. Because of course, these very low income people have a large budget share for food in general. And in these food systems, packaged and processed foods play an increasing role, even in these very recent data. So it's very important for this chapter, I think, to be able to reflect the literature and kind of frontier data in terms of new work to be done. So I hope that, very keen to hear what John thinks and what all of you think of this chapter, but bringing it all together, this is our headline that we have only recently discovered stylized facts about the what's in food and how it affects our health. We have this transition from under to over and then just right, and many attributes of food still to be found. So a lot of research opportunities, thinking about new information and learning about new foods. We've been doing this in terms of very straightforward kind of Kahneman-Tversky behavioral biases, but I think there's a lot to be adopted, as it were, from the technology adoption literature, thinking of these new foods coming in, people not knowing how they work and so forth. A much greater focus on food as an industry, that food is a manufactured product in the main today, coming out of factories with farm commodities as their principal, but not only ingredient, and transformation in the food system, not just additives and so forth, and the policy agenda for that being very, very rich. So thanks very much for your attention. Really look forward to hearing what John has to say and all of you.
Thanks so much, Will and Amelia and Steve. That's really fantastic. Let me turn over to John Hudnut.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, I hope. And can you all see that? The slide,
yep,
slide
we see it.
Yes, we're good. I think that was a yes. Okay. So Will, Amelia, Stephen, my top line comment is that there's a lot to like in this promising draft chapter. 3 highlights for me are that I really like the broad sweep across time, across space, across topic. I really like the fact that you take both the nutrition and the economic seriously, and that the former is presented in a way that is accessible to the latter, who are I see the primary audience for this handbook. And I really like the new data work. When I saw the rotanograms, I had 2 thoughts. The first one was, oh, this is really cool. My second thought was, I wish I had thought of this. But the chapter goes well beyond a simple summary of the literature, so I think that's also a considerable strength in what you're doing. I have 7 suggestions for making a good chapter even better. I'm going to go through 4 in detail, And 3, I'm just going to mention at the end, and we can talk about them later or possibly offline. Number 1 is the coexistence of forms of malnutrition within the same unit of aggregation. So this is from your abstract with a little bit of an addition from me. The triple burden of early undernourishment, then obesity and micronutrient deficiency, accompanied by other diet-related health risks, often coexist in the same person over time, with the same household and community, or my addition, or country. So this point is an important one. It makes some allusions to this idea, but it's underdeveloped in the current version. A slightly different way of phrasing this is that you note that there is this nutritional transition that occurs. At times, and I noticed, for example, both Amelia and Stephen saying, this is not a linear process where you exit out of one state into the other, but the fact you can have these different forms of undernourishment coexisting in the same unit of aggregation is one which ultimately I think is getting underdeveloped in the paper in its current form. And why is this important? Well, I think it's important to recognize is that as these transitions unfold, there can be some paradoxical juxtapositions of different forms of malnutrition. To take one from developing and one from developed countries. Developing countries, in some parts of the world, we see overweight mothers with chronically undernourished children. In the US, when we correlate, for example, household reports of food insecurity, we often see those are positively correlated with the likelihood that individuals are overweight or obese. There are reasons for this, but on the face of it, it's kind of puzzling as to why these paradoxes can exist, and something underdeveloped in the chapter. And that, I think, has important implications for how we think about policy, which is something I'll come on to in a sec. Second comment, gender in inter-household allocation. The chapter is nearly silent on gender. I did a word search. I think I could only find the word gender once, and the word women only 8 times. And most of those references were were in the section on the discussion of anemia. The gender allocation of nutrients within the household is a long-standing area of research interest and concern. The standing assumption being is that women are disadvantaged. This literature, and so what I'm thinking about here is given your broad sweep of the chapter, can you tell a story as to whether this continues to be true? If you think of early work on this topic, so think going back decades, think about people like Sen or Barbara Harris-White or Nadia Kabir, all inspiring a story saying that one of the things which is important for us to understand, in a static sense, how are calories or other nutrients allocated within households? What does that tell us about the underlying dynamics in this household? What does that tell us about the welfare of individuals? We have this long-standing view that women are disadvantaged, and certainly in some parts of the world, there is evidence of that. But does that continue to be true as this nutrition transition continues? And how does that inform about how we see then transition occurring? So this is not just kind of like a ticking off a box idea for encouraging you to give this more attention, but suggesting it may also allow you to discover, or at least consider, some really sort of more nuanced elements to these transitions that we see. Third, I'd like to see more about policy. There are some hints about the policy implications associated with these transitions, particularly in the third section of your chapter, but I think these could be built out further. And in particular, what would be especially helpful would be a discussion as to the appropriate policies and interventions that we need when different forms of malnutrition coexist. For example, one of the countries I work in is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a significant fraction of the population where people do not consume enough energy. Okay, we have children who are chronically undernourished. We have a significant fraction of the population is food insecure. We have women who are too thin as measured by the BMI. And yet at the same time, nearly a quarter of women of reproductive age in the capital, Addis Ababa, are overweight or obese. How do I think about policies when I have that juxtaposition. When we talk about issues around overweight or obesity, we think about ways of saying, well, can we do things that make certain types of calories more expensive? So like taxing added sugars or taxing fats. But do we want to do that in an environment where other group in the population is not consuming enough energy? Maybe those cheap sources of energies would actually be beneficial to those individuals. More generally, understanding the distribution of various forms of malnutrition by gender, location, socioeconomic status matters for how we think about policies and interventions. And that's not coming out in the material you've got so far. Fourth is to nuance the discussion around processing and packaging. I think it's inadvertent, but the discussion you have right now suggests that changes in packaging and processing have been largely or wholly negative. And I think such a view is too strong. Improvements in these areas are important for transitions to healthier diets. I've got a couple of examples here. The most salient one being that of enhancing food safety. A running line for development economists in North America or Western Europe when they travel to Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia is, quote, don't use the salad bar in the hotel because you're going to get sick. And we all know that. But it points to the fact is that we don't consume certain types of vegetables in those countries because we're concerned about their safety. Food safety issues, I think, are in some ways an important but underrepresented, may not be exactly the right word, but basically are underconsidered components. And that particularly relates to fruits and vegetables, relates to animal source foods. And that may also be affecting individuals' dietary choices in places where safety is a concern. But it's also where, if we look again at Western Europe, we look at North America, where one of the reasons for actually moving towards more processed or packaged foods was to address some of these concerns. Second, we can think of certain forms of processing as actually meeting nutritional objectives. Again, we've got lots of examples around the world. So in the United States, we have the elimination of rickets through fortifying milk with vitamin D in the 1920s and 1930s. In developed countries, we have the elimination of goiters and certain type of reductions of iodine deficiencies through iodizing salt. And finally, it's worth mentioning is that there are gendered benefits through food packaging and processing, where that reduces the gendered burden of food preparation, and that falls, as we know, very heavily on women. So certainly there are some concerns about the way foods can be packaged or processed, and the way in which those foods are made available. But I think it's not so much you're overemphasizing the negatives, but I think you're underestimating some of the positives or some of the advantages of packaging and processing. Three final points that I'll say a little more quickly is when I look across the chapter, micronutrients are somewhat underdeveloped relative to the other forms of malnutrition. You might want to see to what extent you could address that. I'd like you to pay a little more explicit attention to the microeconomic foundations of food choice. As Chris said at the outset, one of the features of these handbooks is there are a reference point or starting point for graduate students or people in the early career. Will, for example, you mentioned Bennett's Law a couple of times. Working through Bennett's Law, working through the microeconomics of food choice and how it changes as incomes change, I think would be a nice complement to some of the material you present. And finally, on measurement, some of the stuff you have here is well developed. Some I'd like to see a little bit more of, particularly that around dietary intakes. Dietary intake data are much harder to collect than many economists recognize. And in particular, as diets become more diverse, and as the places where food is consumed becomes more diverse, my suspicion is this is becoming harder and harder to do. And in a forward-looking chapter, which is one of the things we want you guys to have here, that's going to have implications for how we measure trends in these diets, and thus for policies to address dietary issues. But I want to emphasize overall, this is a great first start. There's lots of really cool stuff, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the next version.
Thank you so much, John. That's a fantastic set of comments. I'm sure Will and Amelia and Steve will benefit a lot from taking those on board. Let me invite others to raise their hands, or if you don't want to speak, feel free to just drop your question or your comment into chat. while we're waiting for folks who'd like to add to the conversation, Will, Amelia, Steve, do you have any particular thoughts, responses to John's good comment?
I can start by saying that was fantastic, John. Thank you so much. I think that's a great checklist, and definitely echoes things that I was thinking, like, okay, what do I want to do next? Where one big issue is the very last one you put about micro theory, and going back to that earlier literature, Sen Dasgupta you mentioned, on thinking about the demand system for food, thinking about the underlying demand for attributes that include, of course, convenience, safety, and so forth, not just nutrients, and the health production function, a Grossman model type of approach, and wondering about frontiers for research, in the economic side of the modeling. But I definitely hear you and agree on the other points as well. Amelia and Steve, do you have,
Steve, you're muted still.
I was just thanking John for the excellent comments and expressing the hope that he'll send his slides to us to help guide our revisions.
Great. Amelia, did you want to add anything before we go to Zoe?
No, I think questions would be great. Thank you so much, John. That it's really helpful. And I think I try to think about nutrition as a very similar thing to general well-being. So then I think a lot of econ, there's a lot of opportunity for the micro, right? The micro theory to be in there. And I think that would be really helpful for the graduate students too, to understand, those, how that interacts with the current research and literature.
Zoe?
Hi, thank you so much for the chapter and the comments. And before I start, I'll say I feel like I've been asking a lot of questions in the last couple of days. I hope others will join me in doing so, because I keep asking, being one of the first to ask questions, but I'm sure others have valuable things to contribute as well in the audience. First of all, one thing that I in this literature based on my work in it is that there is some, well, I guess I'll pose my question first, which I think that folks will get, which is that I wonder where the boundaries of economics are here. And I'm not one to want to create silos where there needn't be them. But I also have seen in the literature with this push toward causal inference and the focus on that within econ, that I'm sometimes looking at literature that looks more like it's about nutritional outcomes than really about economics, in the sense that it's not necessarily motivated by economic models. And I just sometimes when I see that, I kind of wonder, and not to critique people, like, is this economics? But I ask the question of, where is our comparative advantage as economists, and what do the people who have kind of trained in this nutrition space think when they see this? And I think it would be helpful in this chapter to help orient new economists in this space to, and I appreciate that there's already a bit of this there, but maybe more directly, to orient new economists in this space to kind of understand, where is it, when do you want to call a nutrition person or an epidemiologist, and where is it that we can really offer the most? So I guess that's one comment. And then the other comment was I saw the attention to gender in the comments, and I just wondered if there was any role of thinking about differences in racial groups here, particularly in the United States, and how the food environments are different or things like that. And I just wondered, I know that's increasingly a place where we want to be looking, and we're encouraging folks to look as a profession. So kind of how does that fit? And then the dark side of that, which is that whenever we get into thinking about anything that might have to do with genetics, how do we talk about that ethically? And so I guess that's the, if there's a part in here where you're talking about, and I'm not saying race is genetic, what I'm saying is that there is this conflation of all these things that we're seeing in the literature. We're seeing some bad examples of research coming out, even right now, in a variety of areas, not specifically nutrition, but is there some orientation that you can give to folks for working ethically in this space? Thank you.
And maybe I'll take the prerogative to jump in as moderator while we wait on other hands. A couple of reactions. First, I'm really impressed with this first cut at the chapter. I think you three have done a superb job of pulling together a huge mass of literature and organizing it in a really effective way that tells some stories. Like John, I'd love to see you push a little deeper into thinking about the microeconomics underpinning it. And towards that end, two quick thoughts I had. One, John made a good observation about relative silence on gender. Let me just flag for you that Agnes and Cheryl Doss have a volume 5 chapter on gender. It's not yet published, it's in review, although I suspect Agnes and Cheryl are very happy to share that draft with you. You may want to link to that. They touch on some of these issues, which may somewhat relieve from you the burden of having to fully cover gender issues in your chapter. That said, it's probably worth linking. Second thought is thinking back to volume 2 of the handbook, the chapter I authored long ago on food assistance policies and food security. I tried to frame a framework of thinking about how food security arises as people treat food as both intrinsically valuable. We enjoy the experience of eating, we like taste, etc., as well as an input into the health production function. And I wonder whether taking that same broad approach may be useful for you as a way of unifying the microeconomic underpinnings, because the obesity problem largely arises from a combination of price incentives and the intrinsic pleasures we get from fats and sugars. In particular, the sensory experience is intrinsically valuable, but with some negative health consequences that come with a lag, and that leads to dynamic trade-offs over pleasure today versus some problems tomorrow. But also, as Amelia made very clear, the problems of understanding the composition of food and how that maps into future health, especially with regard to micronutrients. I mean, we don't have the benefit of the sensory experience of hunger pains that tell us not enough energy, send more energy. We don't get that around zinc or iodine or things. So, you know, people are making decisions under tremendous uncertainty around their own, the inputs into their health production function. And I wonder whether thinking a little bit about how as time becomes more valuable for people, especially for women now entering a workforce in increasing numbers, that their ability to and their willingness to make the trade-offs in making these choices affects the natural rational choice of food purchase and food consumption behaviors. And you can tie that back to the global burden of disease studies, which emphasize things like underconsumption of whole grains as one of the key dietary causes of adverse health outcomes. It's not just too much consumption of fat. And well, anyway, let me stop there. So I think this is terrific. I think you can tie more of the microeconomics in while retaining your core structure quite nicely. Dee Fang has a hand up. Dee?
Hi, first of all, I would like to thank the speakers for a great presentation. It was very informative and helpful. In my own research, I'm interested in policies that promote the healthy food groups, such as fruits and vegetables. So my question is, how do you think the policies such as double up food bags or the healthy incentive pilots, which are basically subsidizing the price for healthy food versus taxes, for example, the Berkeley sugar taxes, how do you think the role of food policy play in promoting healthy food groups? Thank you.
Agnes, and then maybe we revert back to Will, Amelia, and Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Will, Amelia, and Steve for a really excellent overview of the nutrition transition and malnutrition literature. I think you were very ambitious and the scope was very broad, and it's really a very good introduction, I think, for somebody who's starting to work in this field. So I think it's excellent for a handbook. I wanted to pick up on a comment that Zoe made that when do you draw the line between something being an economics paper or an economics topic or a nutrition topic? And you had mentioned the focus on nutritional outcomes. It's very interesting that nutritionists themselves say that they don't like Aggies, or people working in agriculture, necessarily looking only at nutrition outcomes and not necessarily recognizing that it's part of a process. So there is this whole pathways between agriculture and nutrition that Marie Ruel and Harold Alderman have developed. The reason I mentioned this is that all these pathways are actually, I think of them as behavioral pathways, and therefore very much amenable to the type of microeconomic modeling that people in our area would like to do. And I think that I've seen enough papers which try to look at nutrition outcomes, which really don't have the type of behavioral modeling in place. So I think something that can sort of speak to that or bring that into your chapter, maybe as you tackle the microfoundations part, would be good. But otherwise, congratulations. It's a great start.
And let me just give Drew Hanks a quick opportunity. Drew?
Yes, thanks. My question, I think, fits nicely with what Chris was mentioning about this idea of micronutrients and how, we don't, the people buy food, they buy whole items as opposed to micronutrients. And I guess my question was how you see this work maybe lining or potential opportunities in linking with some of the more recent advances in nutrition, like the metabolomics type work, where they are really getting down to these micronutrients and the impacts. But then once again, as a common theme in the questions and comments seem to be this: how do we take that back into that decision framework at the individual level, where people may not be focusing on how much of these micronutrients, while at the same time it is extremely important for their individual health, for their family's health, and so on. So that was the question I had.
Why don't we turn it back to Will and team, or John,
Chris.
please.
Yeah, sorry. It turns out as a co-host, I can't raise my blue hand. But just one observation that will tie some of the comments you all are receiving together is I just went back and did another word search in your draft chapter. If you leave out the legends on the figures, you only use the word prices once. And that seems to be an omission, but I think it's running through a lot of the stuff you're describing. And if I could just kind of build out an example of this that I was thinking about both in your presentation and some of the comments. Separately, I'll send you two graphs, one of which is a graph showing corn production and apple production in the United States since 1980. And not surprisingly, corn production more than doubles and apple production stays virtually unchanged over those 40 years. You then look over the same period of time and you look at the relative prices. And not surprisingly, apple prices more than double and corn prices are virtually unchanged. So what this speaks to, I think, are a couple of things. One of which is that as we understand these transitions are being driven by a number of things, but one of which are changes in relative prices of foods. And that is particularly salient for the fruits and vegetables, where in fact we see, with one or two exceptions, kind of a universally underconsumption of these relative to what we think is desirable. We know in an ag technology sense that there are areas where in fact there's been much less work on yield enhancement. As Chris knows, for example, at Cornell, there's a lot of work on apples and it's got nothing to do with increasing yields. It's all about taste, palatability, making better ciders, that kind of thing. And that, I think, enters into not only giving your work more emphasis on the micro foundations and about how changes is that the micro foundations you have in a lot of your stories around changes in income over time, now that drives patterns. But I think there may be a second story about changes in relative prices that may also have a bearing, as well as changes in accessibility to these types of foods, which are related in part to prices. And that, of course, then also has implications for how you're describing food systems and some of the policy recommendations you might make.
Great. Quick 1 minute of closure, Will, or Amelia?
Yeah,
or
just
Steve?
very, very quickly. Fantastic comments. Thank you so much. Ironic about prices. My big project is food prices for nutrition. But I do want to just pick out of all the things, Zoe's point about group disparities, because the story of research on nutrition has really been to discover how the genetic potential of people is so similar compared to the differences in dietary and health risks. So much of what was attributed in terms of differences in human morphology, heights, weights, and so forth, attributed to differences in population genetics across ethnicities and continents, has now been attributed to things we can change. And so we've observed this common human genetics playing out against differences in nutrition and nutrition transition. And it's such an important theme. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. You all have gotten us off to a fantastic start for the day. We'll take a quick bio break and reconvene at the start of the hour for the Caputo and Just chapter. Thanks so much, Will and Amelia and Steve, as well as John. Great job. Thank you.
See, David, good. Vincenzina, you've got your screen. Perfect.
Okay, let me see.
All right, while Vincenzina is just getting her screen ready, just for those who are just joining now, this is the second presentation of today's workshop presenting early drafts of chapters for the forthcoming Handbook of Agricultural Economics, Volume 6. So now we will hear from Vincenzina Caputo and David Just. And the discussant they'll have is Carola Gravitas from Arizona State. The presentation is intended to last about 25 minutes with 10 minutes for the discussant, after which we'll throw it open for Q&A until about 55 minutes after the hour. Feel free to post questions in chat in the meantime. And I just remind people the session is being recorded, which means that all chats, including private chats, get captured in the record. Let me turn it over to you, Vincenzina. Thank you.
So thank you, Chris. Thanks everyone for being here. I will be presenting the book chapter I'm working on with David Just on the economics of food-related policies, the effects on public health and malnutrition. So today's presentation follows the book chapter outline. We have 5 different sections. In the first section, we introduce and motivate the study by also outlining a number of nutrition and health-related policies that have been proposed or implemented by policymakers. In the second section, we describe the type of data sources available to economists and the methods that have been used so far in the economic literature to measure the impact of food-related policies. We then review the main work done by economists, behavioral economists, and scientists working in other disciplines. And in this section, we highlight how results differ across disciplines, but also within our field. The final 2 sections include some welfare considerations in which we describe the role of public policies and how consumer views those policies. While in the final section of the book chapter, we are still working on it, but we intend to highlight what are the main gaps in the literature and what the future research directions could be or perhaps should be. So I'll start with the first part, which is the main motivation of our study. Obviously, the main motivation is how people make food choices and how these food choices impact the food system and policy. So we all make food-related decisions every single day. We decide what to eat, where to eat, with who, as well as when and how much to eat. And we make these choices multiple times in a day. Now, someone may argue, okay, but those are personal decisions. Why are we, even mentioning, how people make food-related choices? Well, one of the main reasons is because the way people make food choices, and this is what we point out in the first section of the book chapter, has an impact. For example, food-related decisions are related with obesity, and obesity has become a major problem not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. 1 in 3 adults in the world is overweight or obese. Again, here someone may argue, okay, but even being obese can be a personal decision. Yet, obesity is related with a number of diseases, including cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, certain types of cancers, as well as mental disorders and physical limitations. And altogether, these have an impact in terms of healthcare cost, for example, in the US, 21% of annual medical spending is used for obesity-related diseases. Despite obesity, food insecurity remains a main problem, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. For example, in the US, more than 10% of households are either classified as having low or very low food security. And obviously, this highlights the need of policies that address food insecurity problems. So the book chapter outlines a number of food-related policies that have been introduced or proposed to solve obesity and food insecurity problems. Because obviously food insecurity is associated with malnutrition, such as, for example, a micronutrient deficiency. Some of these policies have been targeted to broad populations, and these, for example, include educational programs or fiscal policies, such as taxes or subsidies. Others have been, other policies have been targeted to specific groups within a population, children, food insecure people, or, for example, people living in food deserts area. What we do in the book chapter is we describe those policies, we provide some sort of rationale behind each of those, and we also try to compare how different countries have implemented those policies. For example, in the case of nutritional food labeling programs, we outline what has been done in the US, but also how these programs have been implemented in Europe, in Canada, and other countries. So after outlining these policies, the next step is, okay, now we are economists, right? So what do we do? How do we evaluate those policies? Obviously, we use data and we use methods, models. And so the second part of the book chapter describes which kind of data we use and which kind of methods we use, which obviously depends on the type of data sources available to us. So we start this section by introducing the two main data sources used so far in the literature, secondary data and primary data. The secondary data, we describe both sources, meaning the national survey data collected by public institutions, such as, for example, in the US, the USDA or US Census Bureau, among others. Ironically, this is, these national survey data are primary data. The only difference is that the data is collected by other people. Other types of data, secondary data, are scanner data collected by private companies. And in this case, the data picture actual behaviors, for example, actual purchasing behavior. In addition to secondary data, we also outline the existence of primary data. Most of policy evaluation studies have used economic experiments. In this case, the experiments are built to answer specific research questions. In other words, whatever is in the experiment is going to be in our data set. While in the case of secondary data, this data is usually collected for general purposes, but then researchers use this data to answer specific questions. In the book chapter, we kind of outline a number of pros and cons of each of these two data sources by using some evaluation criteria outlined by Rowe and Just in 2009. And these obviously are internal validity, external validity, replicability, and transparency. So what we do next is we first provide an overview of these data sources. We discuss some of these evaluating criteria, and then we go into a specific, we explain specific pros and cons associated with each data source. So for example, for the secondary data, we describe what are the issues facing researchers when working with secondary data in terms of data composition. And then in addition to the data composition, we say, okay, now what are also other challenges facing researchers when analyzing these secondary data sources. So I start with and we do the same for primary data. I start with secondary data, and the book chapter outlines more than 3 issues related with secondary data. Here, I just want to give you some sort of idea about how we discuss those issues. So one of the main problems with some secondary data sources is the lack of key variables. So here's some example. The survey of income and program participation that has been widely used to analyze the impact of SNAP on food security or insecurity, collects a lot of data on food assistance program participation, but the survey does not collect information on food purchases or expenditures. Likewise, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, this data set has been used is very common in the literature, collects individual nutrient intakes using the 24-hour dietary recall, but the survey does not include price information on food purchases. In addition to the lack of key variables, another point or issue associated with secondary data sources, the lack of timely information. So for example, the USDA Food Acquisition and Purchase Survey actually presents some sort of progress compared to previous surveys, because the survey includes a lot of information about food purchases, expenditure for both food consumed at home and away from home. But the survey fails to provide timely information. In fact, the last survey was completed in 2013. Now, let's say we use this data set today, after COVID and, a lot of changes in what people are buying, where people are buying. So would this data set be enough to picture or to evaluate the effectiveness of a policy? To solve some of these issues, many food policy evaluation studies have used scanner data. However, when it comes with scanner data, these data are great, sometimes very expensive. But one of the main problems is that most of the time the data underrepresents certain groups within a population, such as low-income people, single adults, or minority households. And so these data sets cannot or may not be good enough to explore the effect of a policy, especially when we want to, in some way, discriminate between different groups within a population. In addition to these issues, which are related to the data composition, when working with secondary data, there are also a number of other issues that pertain the ability of the researchers to identify the causal relationship, right? The causal relationship between will give us the net effect of a policy intervention. And one of these is the self-selection bias. And this problem is very common, especially when looking at the effect of nutritional labels and SNAP participation. So when we want to evaluate nutritional label, for example, we want to evaluate whether the label helps people to make healthier food choices, right? However, since the participation is voluntary, it is possible that people who use the label will have systematic and unobservable characteristics that induce them to behave in a different way as compared to non-label users. And this, may limit the internal validity of policy evaluation studies if researchers are not able to account for these confounding effects. A similar pattern is when looking at SNAP. Even there, people who, since the SNAP participation is voluntary, people who decide to participate may have systematic individual characteristics that can differ as compared to people who do not participate, but they could potentially participate. In addition, when it comes to SNAP participation, researchers need to model in some way the inbuilt causal relationship between being food insecure and SNAP participation. So this is just one example of how we approach to the different modeling issues. Obviously, we also outline a number of approaches that have been followed in the literature so far to solve, for example, self-selection bias, and those include the Heckman type approach, difference in difference, propensity score matching, and instrumental variable method. So what we do is for each of those methods, first of all, we explain what these methods do. We then provide examples in the literature that have used those methods to account, for example, for selection bias. And obviously, we also outline some of the limitations associated with the use of these methods. In addition to self-selection bias, we also mention problems associated with price and expenditure endogeneity, aggregation bias, or potential bias from simulations. And we follow the same approach. We basically describe why these can be issues and challenges facing researchers during the data analysis, what are the solutions that have been proposed in the literature, and what are the limitations of these methods. In addition to secondary data, other studies, policy evaluation studies have used primary data, mostly economic experiments. Obviously, when working with economic experiments, researchers are able to construct an ad hoc controfactual by randomizing participants across the control and the treatment group. So many of these empirical problems, will not be there anymore in the modeling stage, just because we can control for, selection bias, and we can often also control for other issues related to secondary data. So here, what we did at the beginning, we were saying, okay, there is this classification by Harrison and List, and they classified experiments in natural experiments, lab experiments, and field experiments. Obviously, natural experiments are the ones that use data that, before and after policy implementation, so actual data. And then they have lab and field experiments, and they classify those experiments related to the type of task people execute during the experiment and the subject pool used in the experiment. So in this case, for example, the lab experiments, according to Harrison and List, are the experiments that use abstract tasks, students, and are done in a lab, and similar for artifactual experiments, abstract tasks with consumers still done in a lab. So when looking at the policy evaluation studies, we were not quite convinced about following entirely this classification, because we don't use in policy evaluation studies abstract tasks, right? Usually the task is the policy evaluation and how people evaluate or behave due to the implementation of the policy. And so we decided to come up with our own classification. So we basically reproduce the same, we keep the natural experiments and natural field experiments, and we classify these two following Harrison and List. But then we said, okay, there is something else here with it we need to capture. And we, after reviewing, I would say more than 200 papers, we figured out what people do in policy evaluation studies is they do experiments and they simulate a market. And then they see how people behave in this market by introducing a control at different treatment groups. So we decided to call this these experiments as simulated market experiments. And we classify these experiments as experiments done in a lab, online, or in field experiments, meaning, you go in a restaurant or in a supermarket, you build your experiment there. Obviously, in this case, people will be aware that you are doing an experiment, and that's what distinguishes in-field experiments with natural field experiments. Obviously, even primary data, have a lot of issues, and most of the issues with the economic experiments are related with external validity, while most of the issues with primary data are related with internal validity, right? So all the issues we've seen before. So when we do an experiment, the main question is, okay, we find an effect, but how big is this effect? And in addition to that, we found an effect by using 200 people, 300 people, sometimes 1,000 if we have enough funds to run experiments with 1,000 participants. But then the question is, okay, I found this effect. Can I then say that this effect reflects what people, the rest of the population, will do, and the rest of the how the rest of the population will behave. In addition to that, we also discussed that most of the time when we build economic experiments, we use simplified context. If I want to analyze the effect of a soda tax, I may use 7 different beverages, but the reality is that people make trade-offs among thousands of beverages. So would this context be enough to reflect what really people do in actual context? Another issue related with economic experiments is that we found an effect, but we don't know how long does the effect last. Because we just do experiments one time, we don't do repeated experiments, because most of the time we don't have enough resources, economic resources, to repeat an experiment multiple times. And so here the problem is, if people get used to that, new market condition, would they adjust over time? And if so, would the effect of the policy remain? So we discussed these issues. In addition, we also talk about, experiments using hypothetical contexts. We also outline a number of studies using different designs to capture the effect of policy interventions. So after outlining the data, we start talking about, okay, now, what has been found in the literature and what is the work done, using secondary data and primary data, and what are the main findings documented in the literature. And what we found, I think after reviewing, I would say more than 300 papers, is that there are contradicting findings. And what surprised me a lot is that, okay, findings different across disciplines, and this is kind of obvious because we use different methods, but there are also contradicting findings within the economic literature and within studies using the same data sources, similar methods, and obviously between studies using secondary data versus primary data. So what I'll do in the next slides, I will just provide 3 simple examples, one for each policy, and I will compare just 2 studies. Obviously, the book chapter reports more than 2 studies, and in outlining these contradicting findings. So I'll start from the first one, and usually policymakers come to us and say, okay, does this work, right? So in the case of SNAP participation, does SNAP participation reduce food insecurity? This will be a very simple question. And if we should provide an answer today, we may say yes or not, or I don't know, because it depends on which studies we are looking at. So here is an example, 2 studies, Hoffman and Jason 2008, Yen and Tal 2008, so same here, secondary data. One study found that SNAP participation has not effect on food insecurity. The other one found that there is an effect in reducing the severity of food insecurity. Now, they both use secondary data, but they utilize a different methodological approach to account for endogeneity or for the causal effect between SNAP participation and food insecurity. Likewise, another very simple example of nutritional labels. Do nutritional labels lead to more healthy diets? The answer is we don't know, it depends. Studies showing that they do not improve diets. Other studies show that they do improve diets. For example, the study by Berryman 2008 using secondary data documents that there is an increase in fiber and iron intakes, while Kroll and others 2002 using an simulated market lab experiment, they found out that nutritional labels did not translate into active behavior change. When we go across disciplines, the differences are extreme, I would say. So here is the 2 example studies, one published in AJE 2014 and the other one public health study published in 2011. Using, the economic study uses secondary data, takes into account price endogeneity, takes into account the substitution effects, and found out that yes, there is a reduction in the number of calories, but half of the reduction in soda calories is compensated by an increase in calories from other food alternatives. While if we just look at the study done in the public health domain, then we can see that what they say is just, okay, if we tax, if we would introduce a penny per ounce tax, then we will have a reduction per capita of soda consumption by at least 20 calories per day. So again, here results are different, and mainly because the methods used in the data analysis. So the last two sections of the book chapter, after providing this overview also of the main results, go to welfare considerations and final remarks. In the welfare consideration sections, we point out that regardless of whether a policy is effective or not, another interesting research question could be what people think about different food policies. Which kind of food policies people prefer, or which food policies is considered by consumers effective? And recent studies have shown that, for example, people dislike fiscal policies, but in soda taxes, fat taxes, calorie-based taxes. In this section, we also look at this. We also look at what is the main argument for policy interventions, and obviously we refer to the standard welfare justification for government interventions. And in the case of health-related policies, it is related to the increase in medical costs because obesity-related diseases. So in this case, what we do is we argue whether policy interventions are relevant and large enough to justify the intervention upon welfare analysis. And we also discuss a number of behavioral studies arguing that policy intervention should be not justified exclusively based on externalities concepts. So here is the final slide. We're still working on the conclusion section, but here I have just some final thoughts I would like to share with you, and I hope I can also get some good comments on this. We would like to outline that, especially for people using secondary data, we need to improve the design of these national surveys, and the question is what, if any, should be our rule in this process. The second one is in our profession, there are people working with primary data and people working with secondary data. And many of us have very strong opinions about what we do and what even other people do. So here the point is primary data have strong internal validity, but very weak external validity. And the opposite is true for secondary data. So here the point is, should we see these two different data sources as complements? And if so, how should we envision our future research collaborations? And most importantly, how should we train the next generation of agricultural economists? And finally, there is also a need for timely information. And so here, there should be some sort of discussion also with policymakers regarding what are the funding's opportunity to build tracking surveys, for example, or economic experiments that can be repeated over time, or national surveys that are collected every 2 years, 3 years, and not every 7 or 10 years. So this is all I have. I think I have 1 minute over. Chris, sorry. Thank you for your kind attention. And I think Carola will be now discussing the book chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincenzina. Very well managed time and fascinating content. Let me turn it over to Carola, please.
Okay, thanks, Vincenzina. I thought this is really such a great chapter. I really enjoyed reading it, and I have to say I did not know this was an early draft because it was so comprehensive. And I just want to start with the main key takeaways that I thought this chapter provides. So, as Vincenzina said, in order for us to understand what interventions are meaningful, we really need a sound assessment of policy papers And in order to do that, we have to carefully evaluate all the data that is available and that is used, but also the underlying methods and modeling that are used to generate the findings. And so I really like that the paper or the chapter covers primary and secondary data in depth that are used and available to conduct the policy analysis. And then another main takeaway is really this chapter is very extensive in all the studies that they use as examples to showcase different data sources, different modeling that is used to shed light on what are feasible instruments that are ultimately used to counter malnutrition and obesity. So I want to start with the impact of the chapter from my perspective. I found it very meaningful that you are, in fact, covering all these data sources and all the data modeling and then link it to policy evaluation, because it's so important to make the valid and reliable policy recommendations. Just the examples that you showed in your presentation that show like you may have the same data set in the same year and just some different modeling will lead to completely different outcomes here. I also really appreciate that you introduce and summarize the secondary data sources, thinking of grad students who read that there's so much out there, and just have that all in one place to understand what is there, how can I possibly use that, right? And then another thing that I found really meaningful is this really rich collection. Once you all read the chapter, it's such a rich collection of studies on different topics like soda tax, fat tax, different subsidies, all in one place, very nicely summarized and giving an overview here. And then given that I do a lot of experimental economics, I really appreciate this new classification of experiments in our field, because I think looking at the studies that we published, often the Harrison and List 2004 classification didn't really fit, and there was sometimes like differing opinions on whether an experiment is artifactual, field experiment, how should we call it? And I think the simulated market experiments category really takes care of that, also including surveys, online studies that we use so often for our studies. And then in terms of another impact of the chapter, I think it is a really, really in-depth overview for novices in the field, whether that's grad students or others, but also a really good summary for those already working on this, just to see all the different studies that are out there. And I think even for teaching a variety of classes, I think I'll use it in my quantitative methods classes, because it shows so nicely how you can use the different models and the different data sources for making policy recommendations. And then just as someone who didn't grow up in the US, I found it also really interesting and useful for academics and professionals who are new to the US and are not familiar with different policies or different data sources. So just have a couple of suggestions, and I'll go by the different sections. For the introduction already holds a lot of content, and I think just adding some figures to the data that you are presenting might be helpful for the reader to get a better start into the chapter. And then there was one reference to COVID where I felt like it's probably not needed, because it kind of opens a whole other avenue, and I just felt like it's not needed in the chapter. For the secondary data section, I think it might be useful to have a table at the end that wraps up all the things that you presented. I would also include probably some definitions here, thinking that maybe grad students who've never heard of scanner data or something like that, they may just not be familiar with it. So maybe having definitions there, and just an overview of all the different data sets that you discuss, which are publicly or privately available, where to find them and how to access them. I think that could be really useful to wrap up that section. For the primary data, I think the experimental distinctions by Harrison and List could probably be shortened and maybe just summarized in a table, and then probably also, like you had this really nice graph in your presentation, putting that together with your own classification, showing some pros and cons, probably also of the different types of experiments to wrap up that section. And just one question I had here was, you discussed so many different experiments, and it was actually a little bit more clear to me in your presentation, maybe also in the chapter, link it a little bit more directly to the evaluation, why they are discussed in detail and what that means. And then another question I had, and I'm not sure if that is possible, if you could develop a measure in the chapter based on your classifications or evaluation criteria that you have in terms of internal, external validity, transparency, things like that, to indicate the usefulness of the different types of experiments. I don't know if that's possible. I thought it would be great if we had that. It might make our life a little bit easier in terms of choosing sometimes what method actually to choose. So those were my suggestions for that section. And then for the section on behavioral economic approaches, I was wondering if you could link the policy interventions more to the motivation from the introduction, the actual motivation from the introduction. And another question I had here, and again, I'm not sure if that is possible, would you actually be able to tell which of these studies have more valid results in terms of your indicators? I don't know if that's possible, but we did see the differences, right? And that begs the question, which study should we trust, actually? So then on the third section, where you discuss the effectiveness of health-related food policies, I really appreciated that you did give different perspectives from like the economic perspective, the behavioral science perspective. And I was just wondering, it seemed a bit heavy on obesity to me, whether you could just place some pointers to other studies here, maybe not even going in depth, maybe as footnotes, because the field is so rich. For the particular section on nutritional labeling programs, and again, maybe it's not possible, but having a short evaluation of all the studies that you discuss based on what you describe in chapter 2 could be valuable, especially for students, to bring it together. It could probably lead to case studies, not by you to develop, but by those who use the chapter to teach. And I remember David actually did use that probably in the winter school that we were teaching, where he prescribed some studies to students and told them use these criteria to evaluate the studies, and just maybe providing 1 or 2 examples of like, this is the study, these are the criteria, how do you actually evaluate that? So from a teaching perspective, I thought that might be good, and ultimately summarizing the studies and the mechanisms used. The section on supplemental nutrition and food assistance, I thought this was really such a great overview from an economic and behavioral perspective. This section is so in-depth, discussing all the data, all the modeling, and just reading through, I was wondering if it's targeted towards grad students, maybe there could be a glossary of the behavioral economics terms you are using in the back somewhere, because priming or nudges, if they have never heard of it, they might just miss what you're actually talking about. And since there is so much information in this particular section, maybe there could be some key takeaways at the end of this section. You do have a neighboring disciplines section here, where you focused primarily on health and nutrition science. And given how much content you have in the chapter and how rich it is, I was almost wondering whether you whether you need something like that, because once you start talking about neighboring disciplines, there are other neighboring disciplines like geography, psychology, and they all kind of discuss this topic. So if you were looking to shorten somewhere, I felt this could be shortened, and just having some footnotes to point the reader to these other studies, because the wealth of information is already there. And then the last one I had was the taxes and subsidies. It felt like a bit of a missed opportunity to me that you are discussing so many studies in this particular part on different taxes, for example, the fat and the calorie tax, that I was wondering if you could have a summary table at the end looking at the different studies and the data and evaluating them. Again, based on your criteria. I guess that was my main thread, like to kind of bring it all together from this really great overview on the data sources together with the studies that are out there. And my final thoughts are, and these are really just some thoughts that I had. You mentioned replicability, for example, and transparency in research. So I was wondering, again, given that it's for grad students, could there be a brief discussion or a footnote touching on pre-analysis plans and experimental pre-registration, because it might become more prominent in our profession as well. It's already starting more in other disciplines. So this might be useful for students to at least know that is out there. And then given that you had so many studies, and if you needed to shorten it, you could probably also just have one big overview table at the end to revisit them and shorten some of the content that you have in the chapter. And that concludes my discussion. It was great to read this. Very, very interesting.
Thanks so much, Carola, for an excellent set of very comprehensive comments on the draft chapter. Let me invite people to raise your hand if you'd like to make some comments. If you don't want to speak, feel free to use the chat boxes. There are already some comments in there. I flagged for Vincenzina and David to take a look at those. Yeah, Drew Hanks, please.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Vincenzina and David, for the great chapter. I have really two questions. One of them relates to data linkages, and I'm wondering if in the review that you've done of the literature, how many of the papers have used, maybe administrative data linked to other data sets, and your insights on how that influences maybe some results relative to what's been previously done. And my second question deals with whether the results, you talked about these contradictory effects, and I'm wondering how much of that is attributed to in some modeling, maybe it was an average treatment effect, and maybe in other cases a local average treatment effect versus intent to treat. So I'm really curious to know where that plays into maybe some of these contradictions and these other things that you're finding in the literature.
Great, thanks, Drew. I might exercise moderator's prerogative to just add a couple of quick reactions. First, I think this is superb. I've only skimmed it. I'm going to read it more closely and send you comments later. But I just learned a ton skimming through this. The massive evidence, empirical evidence you've assembled from both observational and experimental data is just really astounding. And thank you. I think this is going to be a very valuable resource. That said, I was actually surprised at how little you really focus on data and data generation processes and much less on underlying theory. So I was surprised that there wasn't more micro or welfare economic foundations behind any of this. It's already a long chapter, so you need to be a little careful about adding much. but I could imagine just framing briefly the more conventional thoughts on welfare analysis of policies. You have a lot on just looking at results in terms of health and nutrition outcomes, but how do we add those all up? There are often countervailing effects. So as an illustration, and tied to my second point I'll make, when we think about countries that mandate the iodization of salt and try to promote consumption of iodized salt, well, that's having a great effect in reducing iodine deficiency and associated mental health and cognitive disability problems. But excessive salt intake has adverse health impacts too. How do we net these things out? We want to be careful about looking at single dimension indicators. And one of the beauties of welfare economics is it gives us some tools to think about how to do that. I'm curious how far those applications have extended in this space. And so that's the example segues to my second point. You probably want to coordinate carefully with the author team that just presented on the triple nutritional burden, especially some of the things they're emphasizing around micronutrients. You don't emphasize very much. I was expecting to see a little bit more on things like mandatory food fortification policies, whether it's for iodine in salt or it's vitamin A or vitamin D in processing foods, or a very hot topic in several low-income countries is folic acid fortification to combat neural tube defects in newborn children. So the micronutrient part, which I think masters that I'll tackle rather in some detail, you might want to coordinate to ensure there's not too much overlap, but equally that there aren't really important gaps over how policy is impacting that important dimension of health and nutrition outcomes. So I don't know if while we're waiting on other prospective comments, Vincenzina or David, if you have reactions to the excellent discussant remarks you got, or the couple of comments, questions in chat, or that you've heard.
Yeah. So maybe let me go with this first, sets of comments, right? So thank you everyone for, these helpful comments and suggestions. Also, Carola, thanks for the great, presentation. As for the question asked by Andrew Hans, the two questions. So yes, while reviewing the results and within the economic literature, obviously results are contradicting, especially the main motivation is the use of different methods. So for example, the paper by Zen et al. In the AJE looking at soda taxes, right? They show in a table what the estimates will look like if they will not account for price endogeneity. So most of the result, the contradictory findings are driven by the methods used by the different authors. As for the use of both primary and secondary data together, I am not aware of any relevant study doing so, at least for policy evaluation, in the context of policy evaluation. Most of the relevant work, maybe I'm missing something here, but has been done all using secondary data or using primary data. I have seen recent studies, especially in the American Economic Review, not in this domain, but in other fields, where they try to combine, but not combine, but present evidence using secondary data and then say, okay, these data have some internal validity issue. Let's see if the results are not consistent, also using other sources of data. So it's something that in other fields is emerging as a regular pattern. As for Chris' comments, yes, I agree. There is not much theory there. It's more like empirical application. The problem is that we have different policies. And so it's very difficult because each policy needs, has a theoretical background, which differs, when then you look at another policy. So here we made a trade-off between should we emphasize more the theory or the empirical component, but I agree with you. We can point some of these elements out in the welfare consideration section and maybe extend that part. And I like your point of should we look at a single dimension or should we look at multiple dimensions, and why it is important to look at multiple dimensions. So I completely, agree with your second point. And I think that we should include some of those aspects. We do not have anything about food fortification or micronutrient deficiency, and maybe I think that is something worth it to include in the book chapter. There were also a number of comments, especially one from Sawida here saying, do you talk about secondary data or data sources in developed countries, but what about in developing countries where maybe the quality of secondary data is even more, I don't know what is the quality of the data of secondary data in developing countries, but I can imagine that it's not so high. And I have heard, many speakers talking about a lot of missing values or observations that are not repeated over time. So I don't know what is the status of that type of data source in developing countries, but yes, I think it's something that we should mention also in this book chapter. Am I missing other questions that have been asked? I see a lot, many comments.
There are a couple in the chat, but you may want to visit those later. I don't know. Corolla, do you have any other reactions? You've heard a little bit of feedback from the floor.
I think my only concern would be how much longer the chapter will become because it is so comprehensive. That is why I was sometimes a bit hesitant to say like add more, right? Because and I emailed them, like I started reading that on Sunday morning and I read it. I did not stop because it was so interesting to be like, oh, what's coming next, like this. And so I'm almost afraid to say like take something away, because it would be a loss to take anything away that is already there, especially thinking that somebody reads it who has not been introduced probably at all to any of this literature, right? So I think it's really hard because that field is so broad and you can touch on so many points, but I think I would agree most with the additions to the welfare section. I did not touch on that in my discussion. I think that is probably the one that could be extended most. Yeah, it's very extensive. I recommend everyone to read it. It is so interesting.
Yeah, I think this one faces a little bit more of a length challenge than some others, which in many ways just reflects the burgeoning literature in this space. I mean, there's so much work that has been done, and there's virtually no coverage of these issues in the prior handbook. So I applaud Vincenzina and David's effort to fill a very major lacuna. We have just a couple of minutes left. If anyone has any closing questions, or Vincenzina, if you have any last thoughts.
Yeah, so there is here a comment by, I see David just here. Hi. I see a comment from MyWish, and she's talking about, are those differences because experimental data are usually stated preference data and secondary data are usually, measure revealed preference data. Here I have my personal opinion, right? Which may not be shared by many of you in the audience, right? Yes, people, we say secondary data are revealed preference data, primary data are stated preference measure stated preferences, right? But my point is, when looking at the national survey data, to me, those are like survey data. It's just that, these data are collected by other public, by other people, public institutions, but still, even in that data collection process, people state what they do, what they eat, how much they pay for food in a different way as compared to what we do in an experiment, which can be considered a stated preference method. So yes, for sure, the way we elicit preferences matters. But to me, the problem is also, is the way we elicit preferences in this national survey data the right way? And there are recent papers, one in food policy by, I think, Brenda Ellison, pointing out that, for example, the way we measure food insecurity among college students, or the way public institutions measure food insecurity among college students, may not be a valid method. So the question here is, what instruments can be used and how we can improve the way we elicit preference data, regardless of whether we classify those data as stated preference methods or revealed preference methods. The point is, how well are we able to design those tools? So when we see a data set without a price for what the price people pay for what they purchase, right? My question is why that is not there. If people want to look at food insecurity, they also want to look at the price component, because we all know that the price really matters for both food insecure people and food secure people. So that I hope that to include that message in the conclusion section of this book chapter.
That sounds great. Yes, and we don't want any of us to lose our union cards by saying prices don't matter. Well, let me just close by thanking Vincenzina and David for an excellent chapter, and Carola for fantastic comments, and the audience for very good feedback in both chat and spoken comments. We'll take a 5-minute break, so refresh your coffee, grab a bio break. We'll reconvene at the top of the hour to hear the draft chapter by Kathleen Lang on empowering communities using an integrated design of food networks. And Zoe will be your discussant. Thanks, everyone. Marco and Brian, I've made you both co-hosts if you're there. I don't know if you want to just quickly check to make sure you can post your slides. Perfect, I see them fine, Marco.
I've got just a couple of slides for discussion, but I'm sure it'll work.
Okay, great. Yeah, we've had no problems thus far, so we should be all right if you're ready to go. Why don't we give it just a moment for people to come back from their break? All right, we're at the top of the hour again, so we will have now our closing session of today's workshop. I'm really excited to listen to Marco Palma from Texas A&M present on, and forgive me, Marco, either I had the title down wrong or you've changed titles. Either way, this looks really interesting on neurophysiological measures and consumer food choice. Marco has about 25 minutes. Brian Rowe will be his discussant, is allocated about 10 minutes. Then we'll have it open for question and answer. Please feel free to use the chat in between times to pose questions or comments. And please keep in mind that we are recording these sessions. They will be publicly available next week. That will capture all chat, including private chat, not just the chats to everyone. Over to you, Marco. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much to David. Thank you very much for the invitation, Brian, for providing comments, Chris. I appreciate it. The title of the presentation is Neurophysiological Measures and Consumer Food Choice. In fact, one of the things I touched in briefly in a footnote is about this terminology and what does it mean? Why use neurophysiological instead of psychophysiological and other terminology? This is work that has really been building upon work with some of my students. And so it's fairly new for agricultural economics. And so I'm trying to provide an overview that might be appealing to a wide audience. I want this to be a source for people who might have some curiosity about what this all is about. And so the chapter is structured currently into 6 different sections. In the first section, I give an introduction and provide a motivation through the use of an example. And then I give a brief overview of the brain. I don't necessarily provide a lot of details about it, but I want to provide enough so that we can understand why is it that we're trying to connect this neurophysiology with economics, and what is the linkage between these neuroeconomics with traditional or conventional economic models of decision-making. And then I point out in section 3 what I believe are the most crucial aspects of neuroeconomics into the agenda for agriculture and applied economists. I make a disclaimer here that this is not a comprehensive list, and that these are, to me, some of the things that at this point I think have a lot of opportunity for agriculture and applied economists. But as we continue to develop more work in this area, that this may actually evolve into something else. Then I review the Neurophysiological Toolbox. Those are the different equipment that are currently being used. I decided to use about 8 of the most widely used methods for obtaining data. They vary in obtrusiveness, complexity to use, cost. And so I try to highlight here some methods that can be used at a relatively very minor cost, some things that might be already available to most researchers that can be very informative about the preference choice in the food area. And then I think it's important to talk about the ethics of influence. And so I talk about what are some of the things in the literature regarding about if we use these methods to really discover and understand the motivations behind individual behavior. Obviously, this opens the door for influence and choice in a positive or in many other ways. It could be even negative propositions. And so I talk about some of these ethics of influence and choice, and then I have a brief conclusion. So in terms of the introduction, I really started the chapter with a question: why should agriculture and applied economists care about the neural pathway of food choices? And the reason I started with this question in the chapter is I have many friends, colleagues here at A&M and in other places that have very candidly told me, I don't really understand how this is economics. I don't see the economics of these. And so I hope by reading this chapter that at least we can try to put together some platform to show why and what is the role of economics into this big picture of neuroeconomics. So neuroeconomics encompasses a wide range of neurophysiological measures that study the connection between the nervous system, the body, and then decision-making. So in this terminology, using Klein's very old terminology, it would be neuro with an arrow to the right and physiology, which essentially means anything that happens in the nervous system has some manifestations in the body or some changes in the physiology of our bodies. And so the neurophysiology means that we're trying to capture that either by directly looking at brain activity or by looking at the manifestations of the body, such as increasing blood pressure, changing pupil size, changing facial expressions that are indicative of emotions, changing heart rates, respiration rates, sweat gland activity, and all of these measures to try to make the connection between this and economic behavior and choice. And so essentially neuroeconomics merges concepts from economics, psychology, and neuroscience. Although at the end, I argue that there are many other fields that are really starting to play a key role in this discussion of choice and the choice process data. So in my example, I talk about how, for example, obesity and the obesity pandemic, it has been explained at least partially by increased access and overconsumption of of starchy food that is very rich in sugar. And so if we think about these, I go back and say, you know, this overabundance of sugar has not always been present. In fact, if we go back to look at hunters and gatherers, and we look at the way they were procuring food many centuries ago, the survival of the human species depended on us human beings finding a starchy food or sugar to be able to store those calories for periods of food scarcity. So you see the brain structure from an evolutionary biology perspective rewarded the individual in such a way that it was the difference between the preservation of the species. So when we look at the pathway of sugar consumption, it is not really surprising to see that the reward system that happens in the brain when a human being consumes sugar has similar activation as very highly addictive substances like cocaine. Yes, sugar has similar activation pathways as cocaine. After all, the brain rewarded the individual with the primal need for the survival of the human species. And so this example illustrates a little bit of how these urges from an evolutionary perspective might be changing, because after all, the evolution of agriculture has been exponential if you compare with the evolution of changes in the structure of the brain. So the result is that we have a brain that still rewards us for consuming sugar, but sugar is no longer as scarce as it was many centuries ago. Now, this sort of addictive behavior, this sort of anticipation effect that happens when individuals consume sugar, there's neuroeconomic evidence that shows that it's not necessarily prevalent among all individuals, but in fact is only present among obese individuals. So why is this important and relevant? It's important because this example illustrates how the biology of the brain can provide useful insights to design customized programs that target different individuals according to their motivations, particularly those in vulnerable populations. So in this example, obese individuals have different urges than healthy weight individuals. And in many cases, we have interventions that tend to be homogeneous, that we want these interventions to work across all different types of individuals. But there's some recent literature that is starting to warn us about these heterogeneous effects, particularly among vulnerable populations. So here, neuroscience plays a crucial role in trying to understand what are these neurobiological urges that might be working against the desired outcomes for obesity intervention programs and how they differ across different populations. Obviously, we're all familiar with economics, and it provides a foundation to be able to design incentive-based interventions to understand behavior on the different choice environments. And psychology gives us insights about the underlying motivations behind the observed outcomes. So in reality, I summarize in this example how neuroeconomics opens a set of tools to collect automatic data, and in many cases is involuntary, which means that we cannot, unless we were trained by the CIA or some special agency like that, most of us cannot really auto-regulate the pupil size when we're in different types of environments. It's difficult to really try to fake this very rich set of data that is very informative for understanding, predicting, and eventually changing the behavior of economic agents. With a footnote here that I discuss the issues about positive versus normative issues and whether it's appropriate or not to influence the behavior of citizens around the world. Many governments are already doing that, but I'll touch that in a later section. So about decision-making at the brain, we have a legacy of economic work that looks at processes of making choices and decision, including in the food area, as two systems. One system, system one, that tends to be a little bit more impulsive and emotionally driven, and another system, system two, that is more rational and thoughtful. I mean, this idea from economics has percolated into many influential papers. Now, I don't pretend to provide a very robust review of the biology of the brain, but I do point out for potential citations what interested readers can go and particularly look at behavior and functions that are relevant for the economics field. But I do want to continue with this legacy and provide a very simplistic view of the brain, divided it into what Mike Lance called the triune brain, where essentially the brain is viewed as having three different systems or two different portions that have different evolution and that have different level of sophistication for executive function. So in this view, we have the primitive brain, we have the limbic system, and we have the prefrontal cortex. And the importance about these is going to be shown in the next few slides, but these provide the basis for a neuro theory of food choices and choices in general and economic behavior. I don't have a picture of these, but if it looks like me, that's because that's actually a picture of a lateral picture of my brain. So the primitive brain, the brainstem is the oldest brain structure and is responsible for automatic functions, which include temperature regulation, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, eye and face movements, and facial sensations. This is an important part for us because it's the communicator between the body and then the cerebral cortex. Neural activity can indirectly be assessed by identifying the associated physiological responses that we can connect to economic behavior. Now, why is this important to us as researchers? Is because if we have no access to an fMRI or to other equipment that might be more complex, we can still be able to measure these other physiological responses and try to connect that to economic activity. So this is the basic principle, and this is the part of the brain that communicates with the rest of the brain to be able to generate these physiological responses. The limbic system is the center of emotions. We have two different systems within the limbic system, the sympathetic nervous system that produces emotional arousal responses, and the parasympathetic nervous system that is associated with calm and relaxed states. So here I quote Lowenstein's very influential paper in the American Economic Review, when he says it is probably not an overstatement that visceral factors, and he's referring here to visceral factors as highly emotional factors, are more basic to daily functioning than higher level cognitive processes that are often assumed to underline decision making. So this idea actually started to get a lot of traction, and utility models can be context dependent, but they can be very easily modified to have different states of nature. Maybe one state of nature in a hot state that is manifested through the sympathetic nervous system, and maybe a cold state that is manifested in the parasympathetic nervous system. This is important because we as experimenters and researchers, we're able to exogenously induce hot and cold states to see how economic decisions and food choices might be changing. After all, it's not the same to choose a snack in a situation that is completely cold versus another situation where there might be some sort of a rush for time constraints or peer influences or something else. So these are things that we can start to exogenously induce and to see how that compromises the behavior. So one example that I put here in the chapter is about public speaking. Most of us, and there is a very wide phenomenon for this fear of public speaking. So what happens when this public speaking situation comes to an individual, it activates the amygdala, which is a limbic region associated with aggression, fear, and anxiety. So you might be able to observe that if you have an fMRI scanner, but also there is subsequent behavior where the limbic system communicates through the SNS, and then we observe physiological responder of muscles contract, the heart rate and blood pressure increases, our pupils dilate, it activates our sweat glands, and all of these other things we can actually measure indirectly. And the equipment to be able to measure those things is more accessible to most researchers. So this is kind of like the basic of looking at all of these factors. Within the limbic system, there are a couple of structures that I touch on. The nucleus accumbens is one of them. It encodes value and reward. It's associated, the nucleus accumbens and its bioregulatory responses is probably one candidate for the original Hedgeworth hedonometer, that can we maybe be able to directly measure utility, satisfaction, or preferences. And there is previous work that has shown that expected reward of purchasing foods and eating delicious, palatable food results in activation in the nucleus accumbens, or some papers actually refer to the ventral striata, which is a larger region in the brain that contains the nucleus accumbens. So this is very important because if we think about this is like the highly emotional part of the brain, is the closest thing to what we typically refer as our heart. When we think we're making a decision with our heart, it is really the nucleus accumbens that is that portion of the brain that is acting as that hard, emotional, highly emotional response. The prefrontal cortex is the core of executive function and decisions. It is involved in the regulation of emotions, self-control, and willpower. And here, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is the structure that is involved in more rational and unsentimental decisions. So this would be kind of like the part of our brains that make us act more rational, if you may. It is, for example, activated when people decide to forego an immediate reward in exchange for a larger reward in the future in a time preference experiment. In contrast to this, there's one exception here. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex drives emotional decisions, just like the limbic system. So sometimes the VMPFC gets an honorary mention in the limbic system due to its connection to these emotional decisions. So why does it matter, and how does these three systems provide some sort of a framework for an economic condition, an economic theory? So the interaction between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, which have this reward encoding or the benefits, and the interaction with those with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that is kind of like looking at the willpower and exercising self-control, can be viewed as a way to directly biologically evaluate benefits and costs of actions. And that actually sounds pretty familiar to the work that we do in economics. And so this gives rise to the somatic marker hypothesis that unifies these concepts by postulating that economic behavior is influenced by emotions that activate neural pathways in the brain that trigger neurophysiological responses as a result of economic stimuli and economic behavior. So now this section, given the time constraints, I struggled to really try to summarize some of these points. There's a lot more in the chapter about papers, literature that is influential for each one of these topics, but I'm going to try to point out just a few to give you a flavor of some of the content of these topics. So the first one is about developing, testing, and refining theory. We look at neoclassical economics, and neoclassical economists largely relied on simplified assumptions to generate predictions without not necessarily a lot of emphasis in what were the motivations for those predictions. From Milton Friedman to Pareto and many other influential economists, we observed that as long as we had approximately good variables that were very good in predicting behavior, that was kind of like the emphasis in neoclassical economics. So this paper by Harrison and Rudstrom, I think it's something that we as economists can build from, because we always have typically this rigid view that there's a prevalent theory that influences decision-making. So what these guys do here, essentially they say that they characterize the behavior of agents with two different theories that coexist within the same observational data. And in fact, they use a finite mixture model in this paper, and they find that half of their sample behave according to expected utility theory, while the other half had different type of motivations and actually was better represented by prospect theory. So in this case, for example, a simple eye tracking rule can be implemented to rule out expected utility theory or prospect theory based on the way people are looking at that. We can even look at the brain and evaluate the cognitive load to see if the processing is the same as making multiplication that will be equivalent to what people are expected to be doing under expected utility theory. Wang et al. Use eye tracking to show that centers look at payoffs in a manner that is consistent with a level K model. I'm not going to get into a lot of details. The details are in the paper, but this is a model of strategic behavior where naive players fail to take in consideration the actions of other players. Level 1 players recognize the existence of level 0 players and act according to that, and so on. And so these eye tracking models have already been used to look at these theoretical issues. So this line of work, I think it's promising for applied economists because it's a tool to improve design of procedures and to better target interventions based on the proportion of individuals who behave according to different processes or different theories, because presumably they might have different motivations. So one of the things I touched in the chapter is about second price auctions. They've been widely used in the agricultural economics field to provide value in many settings. When we look at the literature, induced values show that 80% of the periods people tend to overbid. This could be a very huge difference of around 10, 11% of overbidding in second price auctions. There have been explanations that have been placed about the joy of winning, risk, spite. Delgado actually uses an fMRI to first introduce social competition in the context of losses as a potential explanation for overbidding in second price auctions. So there's a paper that uses this methodology to understand these motivations to design a way to try to tease out these individuals that have this overbidding behavior to calibrate the willingness to pay estimates. So why is it important to discover the underlying motivations? This is a beautiful paper by Plasman et al., where they look at presented individuals with two different bottles of wine. One was priced at $90, the other one was priced at $10, except that it was the same bottle of wine that was presented under different trials. And when they asked people which one tastes better, everybody chose the $90 bottle of wine. But the orbitofrontal cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain that gives pleasure for flavor, activated more with the $90 bottle of wine compared to the $10 bottle of wine. Why is this relevant to us? First, because it provides neurobiological roots for the reward of drinking the wine. The higher priced wine merges the physical properties of food with the perception of the context of having a better experience that is created by this context. So it's not really just about the physical aspects of food, but also the context that matter in how much flavor, how much reward, how much pleasure we feel by consuming food. This is fascinating because when we look at the neural path of tasty food, it's different than when we look at health and nutrition labels. So going back to my definition of the brain, typically you look at the rewards in tasty food happen in the limbic system, while the information provided in health and nutritional labels activates the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So sometimes we have this backlash when you introduce a healthy nutritional label, presumably because people might see a trade-off between taste and health. So interventions that may be unworthy of these underlying motivations may backfire and create harmful consequences. And I provide two examples in the chapter, one from Genesi that shows that having too small incentives might backfire, and they did this in a children's kindergarten, and they placed an incentive for parents who were coming late to pick up their kids. The problem is that the incentive was so small, the parents actually started becoming late. And there was a larger proportion of parents doing that. From that to Acemoglu, who recently warned us about the dangers of having too large incentives, in which Colombian military actually started to kill innocent civilians to portray them as guerrilla members because there were large incentives for that sort of behavior. So again, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move on here in terms of these underlying motivations. But what's important here is you look at these neural activations in the limbic system tend to start at a very early age, with obese children actually being more susceptible to stimuli relative to healthy weight children. Even the way the areas of the brain of children and adolescents that are responsible for self-control do not seem to activate as much when they look at popular food logos for McDonald's and other fast food companies. So beyond issues calling for public policy action to protect these most vulnerable populations, presumably also because our prefrontal cortex do not fully develop until the mid-20s. So children and adolescents might be at a special disadvantage here in terms of the biology, but it also highlights that different individuals might be facing different motivational urges that are important for policy relevance. We talked about internal validity and this issue. If you're presented with a treatment and a control, the issue of compliance can be done with an eye tracker where you can see what's the proportion of people who actually attended to a label. You can potentially identify if there are lexicographic preferences for special attention for certain features in the label, or for information seeking, or perhaps more importantly, information avoidance of some of these areas. Here, I highlight the very recent work by Lee and Kammerer that uses algorithms based on thousands and thousands of eye tracking data to look at the link between visual attention, salience, and choice. This is important because even if you don't have an eye tracking device, you can get some sort of a measure of what an eye tracker will do using the work of Lee and Kammerer. So most of this work tends to be done in control environments in the lab, but we can exogenously induce changes in that environment to make it more revealing of behavior in the real world. For example, time restrictions, sleep deprivation, hunger, inducing exogenously cognitive load to see how that compromises behavior. There's a replication crisis. I think that Carola mentioned that as a comment in Vincencina's chapter. So here we direct people to the AEA, the American Economic Association registry, and in terms of how to be able to pre-register those experiments. Then I talk about, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through these very quickly. If you have comments, suggestions, if you're interested in getting the chapter and making some comments and suggestions, I'll be more than happy to share that. So predicting economic choices is something that is starting to gain attention. Then I go through the tools and I describe how they differ in terms of truth. It's a very concise review of each one of these devices and how they add to the choice process data. Something as simple as response times was gaining a lot of attention as a measure to really look at the strength of preferences and wearable devices and many other things similar to that. So in the last part, I talk about the ethics of influence. Obviously, understanding the motivations and natural biases of human beings opens the Pandora box for influencing people's decision. In fact, governments in the US, the UK, Germany, and many other governments have teams of behavioral science units that are looking to design policies to nudge people to make better choices. At the same time, there are companies who are doing this for profit. So you can see how these could be an ethical constraint. And so this libertarian paternalism movement relies on the principle that the choice architecture itself is not forcing people to make a particular choice, and that they still have the freedom of choice. So Sunstein, which is one of the co-authors with Taylor of the book, The Notch, provides 4 principles for ethical interventions. They have to increase the welfare of people. People have to be able to make their own choice. They have to be treated with dignity, and they have to be able to have self-government of their actions, including electing politicians. But Roberts adds a 5th principle, which is very important, and it aligns very well with the theme of the chapter for distributive justice. So a nudge that puts a label that explains some information does very little for a person who cannot read, or a nudge to try to induce more consumption of healthy fruits and vegetables does very little for somebody who cannot afford it. And so these are the importance of trying to look at this distributed justice and looking at these different individuals. So to finish, these significant technological advances have made this equipment more available for us to collect a wide range of human behavior. These are not going to completely change what we do in applied economics, obviously, but I think that these are enhancers to try to improve the existing methods and hopefully also develop and improve the current methods that we already have. And so the more transdisciplinary insights that we continue to gain from different fields, I think that this will contribute to the analysis of the economics of food choice. So I'm going to stop right there and pass the baton to Brian Rowe. And Brian, thank you very much for willing to provide comments.
Great. Yeah. First of all, I thought it was a very well organized chapter and really enjoyed reading it. I had taken a deep dive into this literature probably back in the mid-2000s, so quite a while ago, and it was a very pleasant return to the literature thanks to your overview. And I really like the way that you talked about the toolbox, showing both the expensive toys and tools of fMRI and items like that, as well as the very more accessible and cost-effective tools down to EEG and time response. So I really appreciate that as well. I'll share a couple of thoughts overall on the chapter. I think the one question that Marco has been quizzed upon, and when I was deep into this literature, I also got quizzed upon quite a bit, was why bother with this? And if we think about the arc of economics, right, we had classical economics where we had very domain-specific theories, some on the consumption side, some on the supply and production side, and neoclassicism kind of brought that all together, right? So we now had a very unified model of marginalism applied pretty much symmetrically to the consumption and the production side. But obviously, different subfields emphasize different parts. And if we think about production versus consumption, if we think back to that first class we had, we learned all the marginal conditions. Perhaps it was the consumption side first in your class, maybe it's the production side, and then we flipped the utility function to a production function. We changed cost to expenditures, and just said, see, it all kind of applies over on the other side. In agricultural economics, though, we've spent a large amount of time thinking and obsessing about the production function, and really with great success thinking about what does the structure of that production function imply for policy, insights such as kind of von Liebig relationships and nutrients, biological lags in the production function giving rise to very specific supply side responses, some very important insights from that. But I would argue that we have not really embraced that obsession with structure if we flip ourselves back over to the U function rather than the F function, the utility function, rather than the production function. And this is essentially where this chapter and this literature can really provide some input to take a structure about how do we create utils and give it as much attention and thought as to how we produce our widgets. And, Becker had that great article talking about how we need to kind of take tastes as given. And that kind of, I think, may have excused our ability to, excused us from kind of diving deeper into this and kind of put a pause on things. But through our kind of reconnection with the hedonists out there, those wishing to get down to actual how utility is created back to Jevons's and Mill's time, have really kind of reunited us with that possibility to glimpse inside of that black box of structure. And again, it's really important now because structure is a bit passé, and we've heard a bit about this during previous handbook chapters as well, and how reduced form analysis powered by just larger and larger amounts of data has really dominated. But I would argue that then makes the marginal value of insights about structure even more critical. And agricultural economists, I think, are very well positioned to be able to bridge that gap between science and economics. As we have on the production side, I think we are suited and suitable to be able to help make that translation possible. So again, a lot of great things about this chapter, well organized, much better written than the one I was in charge of helping write. So kudos to you in terms of having in a very strong formation so early on in the game, or early to me, I guess. So I think the big question then becomes in my mind is, how do we prioritize the use of these to the advantage of agriculture economists, applied economists in the area of food? And I think this is where we have to start thinking critically about where does the decision-making structure only going to be observable or most efficiently revealed through these techniques. And again, here, maybe this is where the chapter can help us identify maybe some areas that you think where these are going to complement the big data revolution the best, or provide kind of unique validation of extant methods, right? We knew gains and losses were processed asymmetrically from Kahneman and Tversky's very early work with just word games and such. But it was very nice, several decades later to then really identify exactly where those were being processed and maybe provided a little more validation and perhaps some more insights about why those gains were being processed differently than losses. And now we know they're coming from different structures within the brain. Perhaps some notes about, we're very good at walking across our campus to the production units and embedding ourselves therein, oftentimes through connections through our experiment stations. It's probably a little longer walk. I know it was for me, a few more cold calls when I started down that path 15 years ago to try to do some of this work. How do we connect with our medical schools and our psychology departments where some of these toys are kept and some of these methods are taught to make sure that we can conduct that research in a way that's faithful to the best techniques in the field. I'll note that there's also some nice work out there. This is a very comprehensive chapter, but you couldn't get to it all. And I just give a tip of the hat to some of Trent Smith's work as well. He doesn't use neuro scanners or things like that, but he does have some very strong biological modeling that connects with economics, and his natural addiction paper and a few others in that field, I think, are really nice ways to think about how applied economists can make that link. I don't think he necessarily had access to some of those toys and collaborators, but it sets up nicely and kind of shows a nice way that structural knowledge of those biophysical systems can illuminate very important issues like obesity and addiction and some of the other things that he talks about in his work. It's easy in this chapter to get in just a few sections in there. There's a lot of kind of just straight up behavioral econ results, which are very fascinating in and of themselves, but don't necessarily have highlight the role of neuroeconomics or these suite of methods of which you speak. So just maybe a little push to help focus and frame some of those sections to kind of concentrate those a bit more towards the uniqueness of the neuro and biophysical methods towards the good of it. So to make sure that's you're using that space wisely. And a very nice discussion of the ethical considerations. I'm glad you had that chapter, that subsection in here. You might be able to push the framing a bit more towards the relative merits of positive versus normative use of these techniques. And a lot of these techniques, the marketing techniques, both for neuro, and we've seen some recent examples more on the genetics side as well. I know you don't dive into the genetics work in here as well, but it's kind of an interesting, right? The business literature, the marketing literature, we seem not to bat an eye at trying to figure out how we can manipulate words and images to get people to buy more stuff that might not be that healthy for them. But there seems to be this divide once we get into the biophysical world of brain scanning or genetics that gives us the heebie-jeebies, and we really get ethically on our toes. Even though it's basically some of the same things that are going on with manipulating just normal communications. But it's interesting how that kind of chasm opens up there once we get into methods that look deep into the brain or the genetics. I'm trying to think about your intro example of obesity was very compelling in some ways, but I didn't think it quite hit the highlight of really showing how neuro really makes the connection in that particular example for illuminating a path towards tailoring. And maybe this is going back and visiting some of Trent's work on that as well, might be able to provide some insights therein. So I think a little bit about that example, maybe switch it out with another example where you can really show where the neuro aspect really did alter, or really solidify the validity of the example or paint a new pathway to policy, specifically because of one of these new techniques that wasn't able to be provided by kind of simple experiments or market data. And then maybe a bit of a shout out to, I know you don't go terribly deep in terms of brain regions, but I think hippocampus and memory have some pretty strong implications for habits and branding. There's that paper by McClure and others showing how Coke and Pepsi show up differently and engage the hippocampus differently when people are choosing between products. So I think it might be good just to give a little tip of the hat there in the section as well. And generally, I think, again, I think you're pointing us in a great directions here. I think some of the areas for these things that you can also think about, and I think you do cover a lot of these in some ways already, but just kind of my list for thoughts that popped to my mind in terms of ways to wield this, again, is to, we spend a lot of time on technical change, but we've been very averse as a profession, as a discipline, to thinking about preference change. Oddly enough, given that a lot of us are side by side by business and business schools where they're teaching advertising to do more than just provide information, but to fundamentally change preferences, particularly at the youth level. So preference change, I think, is a very critical area of focus through advertising and branding. Addiction, self-control, habit formation, habit change. Again, thinking about changes in behavior over longer periods of time and biophysical mechanisms there, which kind of goes side by models of learning that I think some of these techniques can really illuminate as well. And then maybe arcing back over to more of the biochemical influences on decisions in the food area as well. You know, we've got THC being legalized in many states, and I know there's a few nascent articles out there linking that to changes in food consumption as well. But one thinks that that might be an area where we could provide at least some niche insights into that emerging market, as well as issues with satiation and sensory priming that might be nice places for us to connect not only with our neuroscientists and our psychologists, but also our nutritionists that are oftentimes at least adjacent to our colleges that many of us are in as well. So just some thought there for possible additions. Again, I think some of these you mentioned already, but might be places where I see these techniques could really help provide some illumination. So I will pause there and kick it back to you or to the group, or however the chair would like to proceed.
Oh, well, thank you very much for these comments, Brian. I really appreciate it. A couple of things there that I think I marked: the positive versus normative. I added a footnote, but failed to include it in the conclusions. And I was working on these at 10 p.m. the day of the deadline. So I just sent it the way it was. And I knew I had to come back and revisit. But you bring great insights, particularly for me to go back and look at Trent's work and maybe to see how I can leverage some of your comments within the structure of what we already have, or maybe even try to expand that structure. So that's very useful. If you could share those, I make notes, but if you could share those with me via email, that'll be fantastic.
I'll send a marked up file if that's more detailed comments too.
So just a note, we do have time now allocated to the audience for their comments, questions, or other issues. Just use the raise hand feature. I see Vincenzina has already got her hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, David, it doesn't work. So thanks, Marco. This was a great presentation. I think that this book chapter is going to be a great addition, especially in our field. I was wondering whether, you're listing a number of tools that can be used, and I was wondering whether in your book chapter there is something that in some way directs people to how use the let's say, the variables, right, that we get from these machines, and how to incorporate those then in economic models. Because I'm thinking of, especially graduate students for the first time saying, okay, I want to do an eye tracker, an eye tracking study, but then maybe, they need to have some sort of idea of how even a data set, including eye tracking, data looks like, and how and which kind of information can be used, included in economic experiments, in, choice models. So I was wondering whether you have this component in your book chapter, and whether that can be something useful for the entire community.
Thank you, Vincent. I think that's a great comment. I have some of it through the section that talks about the agenda for ag economists. So I try to highlight some things that I think where these devices have really clearly made a change in illustrative examples that would be, in my view, interesting for the reader, but at the same time, that will drive your attention to go seek those papers. Unfortunately, the chapter is already pretty long, with, 10 or 14 pages of citations already. So what I do is I give a brief description of these devices in the toolbox, but then I give people references to go seek additional information. So typically, there are 3 neuroeconomics chapters already that are different other resources. So I try to give people something that is either a review or something that directs them specifically to that. If I wanted to talk about eye tracking, I probably need about 4 pages just in eye tracking. And if you look at the compounding effect of doing this for each one of these, we're talking about a book probably by itself. And so what I do in the chapter is I direct the readers who might be interested in particular things. This is how this could be used. For example, time analysis to assess preferences. We send them to Ian's Cracksbig's paper and drift diffusion. We set the example, we set a couple of citations relevant to food, and so they can go and find out how that is done. And so that's kind of like the approach I've taken, rather than doing a comprehensive review, because that will need probably 2 or 3 times the space of what I currently have there. But I think that's a great and important point, and I try to do as much as possible of that to direct the readers to additional resources.
Thanks, Marco.
Let's see, do we have any other questions from the audience? I guess one question I had is just about philosophy with this chapter, where you're presenting something that's going to be relatively new to the vast majority of agricultural economists. Trying to draw the line between, how much should you present that is just general neuro and physical economics, right, versus the direct applications in agricultural economics. Because it seems like you run up against space constraints, so it's you've got to make those decisions on the margin. So what are your views on that? I have to admit, I've skimmed your chapter, haven't quite read it yet to see how you decided that.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So I spent a lot of time trying to look at the structure of these, and so I've collaborated with many people throughout my career, and I think somebody mentioned once you get into the behavioral science, the behavioral economics and the psychology, that's a very slippery road that you go down. And so just this is the reason why, Brian, I decided to, in some cases, cite some very relevant papers that are mostly behavioral econ, so that people can get the flavor. To me, going to this neuro world is like going from A to D. And so, I mean, how do you present enough information so that maybe others are interested in going through B and C before we get there? And so this is why I had these kind of like a mixture between issues that are purely behavioral econ oriented, sometimes experimental econ oriented, because a lot of these experiments that we do, a lot of this work is done in controlled environments. So we face some of the same issues and criticism. We have exposure to the same criticism as lab work. And I think you, Brian, and David actually wrote this pretty nice chapter about these different external, internally valid methods, and I touch about those things and how this combination of approaches need to be informative to really go back to Jevons' insuperable obstacle to say something about the real world. And so that's what I tried to make that connection. And I tried to put a little bit of flavor so for somebody who maybe has been doing stated preference work, maybe experiments without incentives. So I want this to be a resource for people that if they do not have access to neuroeconomics equipment, that at least they get this intellectual curiosity of starting to do little things that might actually get them a little bit more into these underlying preference understanding.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's I think this is somewhat of a unique chapter in that respect, in that you know, it probably won't be just graduate students picking this up and reading it, but you're going to have a lot of people who are mid-career thinking, here's something that's connected to what I want to do in some way, and how do I get started?
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things, you know, I didn't really mention these there, but except for the fMRI, we have all of the other devices here at the Human Behavior Lab, which are directly under my control. So if anybody's interested and don't have access, I'm always open for collaboration. We do have an fMRI on campus, but we haven't really done a lot of work with it. But all the rest of the tools are available here. We have the largest academic lab in the world. He's sitting right here. So if people are interested, obviously they can get in touch with us. And this is hopefully what we want to do to spark some curiosity, to start to make the case that there is some economic component behind this. And this is not just playing some psychology things that are completely unrelated to our departments.
I guess the other question I'd have is just, when it comes to experimental economics, there was so much focus over, say, the last 15 years of sort of shifting things out of the lab and into the field. Is there any scope for doing this sort of work in a field setting?
Yes, and I actually mentioned there a few devices that are pretty interesting in the future. For example, there's pretty cool work. I didn't have time to go through that. There's pretty cool work. I think Defang is here. I see her somewhere, that are starting to do VR experiments. I mean, this paper was just published this year, very recently. There's some other work, you know, in the environmental side that I also cite in the paper by Ricardo Scarpa. So there are some things that within the confines of the lab, we can create a more realistic environment where people feel they're inside this environment, and it might be more realistic. So you can go from there to really understanding how people make decisions in a retail setting. I talk about wearable devices and how understanding different motivations, we might be able to push different treatments in a much larger scale. Ian Cratchbridge and a couple other people are already running experiments to the masses. They're investigating the technical aspects of doing eye tracking essentially online, where people are using their own web cameras that will potentially improve getting eye tracking data on a scale that would be representative of the United States, for example, if you're able to open these up. So these are issues that we're just in the very infant stages of this technology, but we're starting to see some potentially big changes. And I think this is an exciting time for people who are interested in doing this. The cost of these devices has decreased dramatically from the point when we bought our equipment for these labs to today, making it a lot more accessible. So I touch on all of these issues. There is the work by Colin Kammerer and Lee, where they actually use a lot of data from eye tracking to create predictive algorithms of what the visual attention will be based on saliency. And so if you have no access to eye tracking, but you want to compare labels that you want to implement in your paper, this is a fascinating way of actually getting a very good proxy of how to get this visual attention data without having to purchase an eye tracker. And so there are many opportunities that I try to highlight through the chapter of, look, you don't have an eye tracker. There are ways in which you can at least start to investigate some of these issues potentially. And so that, I think it's an interesting, for me, it's fascinating, obviously. And the challenge is, how do we how do we put the word out in terms of matching what we do, augmenting some of the models that we have traditionally to enrich those motivations to more accurately look at theory. For example, if we think that a process describes what people do, we can set markers to look at those and really understand, is it really a level K model or is it something else? And so I think that's a pretty cool way of looking at it.
That's great. Absolutely fascinating. Also, I think this is going to become more and more valuable as some of these technologies become a lot more commonplace and a lot cheaper over the coming decade or so. Thank you both to Marco and Brian. I didn't see any other questions, and so I was going to head towards wrapping us up. I just want to first off thank the AAEA for their support in putting this workshop together. I think they did a spectacular job. This went off without a hitch, at least from everything that I was able to see. And thank you especially to the chapter authors who presented. I think they did a wonderful job. These are very high quality chapters, and I really look forward to seeing this book in print eventually. For the wonderful resources is going to be. Thank you as well to those who are discussants and participants. Everyone did an excellent job. As Chris mentioned, the authors would like feedback. These are still chapters are in a very early phase. So please, if you still have questions that you want to ask or comments you want to make, things that you think might be missing from these chapters based on the presentation, email the authors. If for any reason you don't want to email the authors directly, feel free to email Chris or I, and we can try and filter and anonymize your comments if desired. And I guess, Chris, did you have any final words?
No, thanks. The only thing I would add is for those who missed part of today or who missed Tuesday, the recordings should be available very soon through the AAEA. They should be sending out an email notice, and it will post on the AAEA website. So look for that, and please share it with your colleagues who missed this, who you think might benefit from listening to some of the presentations. But thank you all. This is really a fantastic day. I've been drinking from a fire hose all day long.
Yes, and it's after doing 4 of these, I feel like I know a lot more about our discipline than I did before. I also feel like I've got a lot of reading to do. Thank you to everyone, and take care.